welcome to Safe on Deck. My name is Antonio Gemma More. For Episode 2, I sat down with Lieutenant Commander Phil Webb. In 2015, Phil retired from the Department of Defense with over 27 years of distinguished service in both the United States Marine Corps and the United States Navy. Phil began his naval aviation career forward deployed to Japan and logged over 900 hours in the SH-60 Bravo Seahawk helicopter, transitioned to the training command in Pensacola, where he flew over 1,300 hours as an instructor pilot in the TH-57 Bravo and Charlie Sea Ranger helicopters, and has flown over 4,300 hours of combined military and civilian flight time to date. Phil owns and operates and preserves two unique pieces of aviation history, a 1942 Boeing PT-27 Stearman biplane, and a 1983 Yakolev Yak-52 Aerostar. And he's an active member of the Veterans Flight and the Commemorative Air Force. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, Episode 2 with Lieutenant Commander Phil Webb. Enjoy. This is the first time I've done one of these with a resume, which is awesome. But before I even get into any of that, I just kind of want to talk through your path, because you are obviously a retired naval aviator, but you didn't enter the Navy originally. You were a Marine. Is that correct?
That is correct. Let's see. I enlisted in the Marine Corps right after high school, and so that was 1988. I know that's going back a ways. And I served in the Marine Corps Reserves from 88 to 95. The goal was always to fly, one of the things I always wanted to do. And I looked into staying in the Marine Corps and flying with the Marine Corps. Unfortunately, they didn't have a program that kind of fit into my situation. I'd gone to the University of Missouri, graduated with my bachelor's. I have a degree in history, degree in geography. And when I got my degrees, I started looking into the flight programs. And Marine Corps, they wanted me to sign up, go to OCS, select out of there. The problem with that was the quality spread. Top third, middle third, bottom third, being in the top percentile of each third, so to speak. So it would have been very hard to gauge where you're at in the class if you were interested in aviation. So the likelihood was that the Marine Corps was going to get to pick what you did. So I had applied for the Navy, and when I went in to apply, the recruiter said, "Hey, we're not hiring any pilots right now." And I got a little bit put out by that, but I was like, "Hey, I want to apply anyway." Well, lo and behold, ended up coming back, and they were hiring pilots, and so I got selected for the Naval Flight Program in 1995.
Okay, so from there, OCS, I'm guessing, next, and then to Pensacola?
That's correct. Went to officer candidate school right here in Pensacola.
It was? Okay, that's right. So yeah, That dates me a little bit, because OCS for me was in Newport. For you, it was here. That's so awesome.
Right. And yeah, it's pretty amazing. I started my career right here, ended my career right here. But yeah, I came down to Pensacola for my flight physical, and obviously things went well there. Got selected for the flight program, and I started in May of 1995.
Okay.
It was the day after Cinco de Mayo. That's how I remember that, the 6th of May.
Absolutely. That's awesome. What was, as a Marine, I know obviously once a Marine, always a Marine, but as a Marine, what was Navy OCS like? Was it, I don't know, I can't imagine it was a kick in the pants, because as a Marine, obviously Marine boot camp is significantly different, I guess I'll say, than the Navy OCS. But what was that experience like for you? Well,
it was an interesting experience, and you know, it was another opportunity to be presented with Marine Corps drill instructors. So I'd seen those in Marine Corps boot camp, and then back for OCS, got to see Marine Corps drill instructors again. So 3 months in Marine Corps boot camp, and then another 3 months in OCS, I've had my share of Marine Corps drill instructors and their methods and whatnot. But the biggest or most striking difference between the two programs was in Marine Corps boot camp, you did not have the option to get out. You were in. You enlisted. in Navy OCS, you could DOR, drop on request, at any time. So it was more of a mental aspect in my mind. In the first, you had no choice. You had to succeed in order to complete that training evolution. In the Navy, you could have walked away at any time. And I had some friends that did, so it was unfortunate. But much more mental toughness required, knowing that you could just walk away from the program anytime you felt like it.
I'm trying to remember how many folks we lost when I was at Newport. I don't believe it was that many, and if anything, it was folks that maybe rolled to another class. Was that a thing, that folks would roll to another class, or more often they would just DOR entirely and leave the program itself?
Well, you had both. Anybody could drop on request at any time, so a lot of people were not used to that type of treatment coming from the civilian sector, and so it was pretty shocking to them, and a lot of them quit. And they DOR'd, they were out of there. They used to line up every night the chrome domes, the silver painted helmets, and of course they would take name tape and put everybody's name across the front. And so every night when you'd come back to the barracks, they would have all the chrome domes lined up, and you'd see just who had quit during that day. And you started out the first few days, there was high attrition, 10 guys might quit, 8 guys might quit, and it kind of tapered off. But you still, throughout the program, had people that would DOR at various times.
And Phil, you mentioned guys. Was it only men going through the AOCS program, or were there any women at that time?
No, at that point, the program had kind of shifted a little bit. It had been AOCS, which was Aviation Officer Candidate School. But by the time I went through, it had combined and was just Officer Candidate School. So this was across the board, all of those that were coming in to be officers in the Navy. And it was combined male-female.
Okay. That's really awesome. So obviously for me, it was everyone. You were going SWO, Intel, Aviation.
That's right.
Yeah.
Supply.
Absolutely. Yep. Everyone was combined all at Newport. But that was something that I always felt that I'll be honest, just kind of missed out on, was the experience of being in OCS here in Pensacola. And gosh, seeing those helmets had to be motivating. Was it also motivating to see those aircraft fly overhead and be part of an aviation base here at Pensacola while you were going through OCS?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We were all very keen on aviation. This is what the majority of us had signed up for. So every Tuesday, Thursday, when the Blues were practicing, despite the best efforts of the drill instructors, anytime we were in formation, anytime we were outside, anytime the Blues would fly over, everybody would always be looking up to see those aircraft. So it was a very inspiring time, and there was a lot of anticipation, a lot of eagerness, and we were all very keen to serve and get out there and start flying.
Absolutely. I'm going to date myself a little bit. What year was that again?
1995.
So those would have been Hornets, probably the baby, or what we call the Legacy Hornets now.
That's right.
So just newly introduced to the Blues at that point, I'm guessing.
Actually, they had been in since mid-'80s.
Oh,
so
gosh,
about
wow.
86.
Okay, never mind. So, yeah, never mind. They'd probably been flying shows how little I know about the Blues. Okay, awesome. So let's see, any other memorable memories from your time here briefly? I say briefly, but your time at OCS? Anything good that sticks? I have a couple stories, none of which, unfortunately, are suitable for telling in this format. But
well, OCS was a good introduction to Pensacola, and it was really neat to be here. And there's always some great stories from OCS. I'll spare everybody some of those. But one memorable time, we were all out doing close order drill right there next to the bay. There's the old aprons that they used for seaplanes back in the 1920s and whatnot. And our drill instructor had brought us to a halt. He'd turned us to face him, so right face. And he goes, "Hey, wasn't one of you guys supposed to be a meteorologist?" And this kid in the back says, "Yes, sir, that's me. I'm supposed to be a meteorologist." And the drill instructor said, "Everybody, keep looking at me, but you're supposed to be a meteorologist, I want you to turn around and tell me if that's a tornado or water spout or whatever you call those things." And he turned around, looked back, there over the bay. "Yes, sir, that's a water spout." And of course, at that point, everybody turned around. So anyway, it was just kind of one of those memorable moments. I guess you had to have been there, but despite the best that Marine Corps drill instructors could do, there was no discipline, and we all looked around at that water spout.
So after OCS, obviously commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Navy.
That's correct.
Now it's time for, back in our day, Back in the day, it was API, Aviation Pre-Flight Indoctrination. I think I got the acronym right.
That's it.
Now it's NIFE, Naval, and I think I'm going to get this wrong, Naval Introductory Flight Evaluation. So similar program, different name, similar theme, and that is, okay, congratulations, you're an ensign from the Academy, from OCS, from ROTC. Now you're here. So let me back up. From one of those commissioning sources. Now you're in Pensacola. Here's your very basic taste of naval aviation, starting with the chip trail, the run, obviously going through the dunker, that type of thing. But the dunker experience that you had is very different from the experience that myself and everyone going through now has. You did a little bit more of it actually in the bay, right? Was the H3, the helicopter, part of the syllabus for you guys?
That's right. So back in those days, yes, we did go through API, Aviation Pre-Flight Indoctrination. That was about a 6-week course, had a lot of classroom stuff, learning all the basic subjects about aviation. You did things like engines and systems, meteorology, flight rules and regulations, aerial navigation. I know I'm probably forgetting one, weather. So you did all your classroom work, very rigorous, aerodynamics, very rigorous. But you also did a lot of physical training and survival stuff. So we went out to the range in Eglin. We did overnight survival. Once you completed API, we also did swims. But once you completed API, they had a program called DJET, and that was to train all the guys in case they were going to go tactical jet pipeline. Things like ejecting out of an aircraft, water survival, those type of things. So we did several training evolutions. One of the most memorable was we went out in the bay. We basically did parasailing. They got us up to altitude. We were in a parachute. Now the difference here was instead of being drug along by a ship via a tether, we actually released our Pelican hooks and we floated down in the parachute. And the whole idea there was we needed to prepare ourselves for water entry. And as we're coming down, for example, pulling up the visor on your mask, removing your oxygen mask, taking off your gloves, stowing them properly, getting ready for water entry. Once you hit the water, then at that point, you wanted to release your hooks from the parachute harness, sweep over your head to make sure that you were clear of the shrouds, because if you got entangled in those, they could pull you under the water. And once you were clear of the parachute, then overhead would come the station starbird, H3, and they would drop a rescue hook to you. You, of course, were given proper hand signals up to the crewman that's looking down at you, give him a thumbs up. The hook would come down. You wanted to make sure it hit the water surface first so you didn't get static discharge. You would hook it up onto your survival harness. They would pull you up about halfway, make sure that everything was working out, and then they would drop you back into the water. We called it teabagging. But it was great training, and we did that right out in the bay, right out in the open elements.
Wow, that's awesome. And you mentioned, I think the time of year you did it was pretty cold as well. So
yes, like anything in the Navy, whenever I came through, it was wintertime, so it was Pensacola was very nice 90% of the time, but it was winter, and the water temps were cold, and the air, a little bit of breeze coming off the beaches. It was pretty chilly conditions.
Okay, that's awesome. You mentioned also Eglin, which is a surprise to me. I didn't realize there was any part of this. I mean, we have a small, there's a building basically at NASP that has, a little bit of that training. There's a greenhouse, and they talk you through how to start a fire and very basic stuff, at least for myself. I didn't really get into the advanced, actually in the field part until SEER, which was post-wings, obviously post leaving Pensacola. I did mine up in Maine. But so it sounds like there was a little bit more actual hands-on training accomplished here before you even touched an airplane. That's interesting.
That's right. I want to say it was maybe a full day. There was some classroom training, and then you would go out to Eglin, out to the ranges, kind of out in isolated areas, nothing really around, and you do a little bit of survival stuff out there. Long story short, you ended up spending the night out there, and you were in a flight suit and everything. And they wanted you to try to build shelters, and they gave you a parachute so you could use the parachute to build shelter and all that kind of stuff. Did a lot of training with parachutes. That's the one thing that you would find yourself with if you had bailed out of an aircraft. So it was great training, and again, in typical Navy fashion, it was very cold that night, And I remember all of us, we built a fire. We're trying to stay warm. And one of my buddies, he was a big hulking Marine, last name Orlaskus. We all called him Orly. He would get up, periodically and go out and forage and bring back some wood to keep the fires going. Well, finally, after sleeping on the cold ground, pretty miserable, I got a stick and I made like a little trench in the ground, and I took some of the hot coals and I put them into the trench and then covered it with ground and then laid back down on top of that, and it was nice and toasty. It was an old Boy Scout trick, but I slept pretty well after that.
That's great. Okay, cool. So back to API. Again, just a very basic introduction. From there, either you can stay here at Whiting, or you can go, I say stay here at Whiting, stay in the Pensacola area and go to Whiting or head to Corpus.
That's right.
Where'd you end up going?
And I elected to go to Corpus Christi. So I went to VT-28. We were the Rangers.
Okay. And the T-34 Charlie, right?
That's right.
Turbo
Flying
Mentor.
the mighty Turbo Mentor, the T-34C.
One thing I guess I need to back up, and sometimes I get a little too far ahead of myself. Did you have any prior aviation experience? I mean, you mentioned obviously you had an interest in aviation, but did you have any flight time, flying airplanes, gliders, anything at all before joining the Navy?
I did. I had about 35 hours of flight time. All VFR stuff, all flying little Cessnas. Had always wanted to fly, so, flying is a very costly endeavor. So, working my way through college, I had aspirations of getting my license and whatnot before I got in. Unfortunately, that just didn't pan out financially. So I had about 35 hours total when I came in.
So you had a little an exposure, which is awesome. What was that first exposure in the T-34 like? Obviously, you go through all your ground school, those very basic classes, you learn EPs, but then that first time you're sitting in the front of a T-34 Charlie starting up a turbine engine, that probably was a little bit different from that Cessna.
Yeah, it was exhilarating. It was something that we had all looked forward to. A lot of the guys in my OCS class, they were very keen on aviation. We actually had a lot of experience in my OCS class. We had one guy that had 4,000 plus hours, had been with the commuters. We had a number of guys that were well over 1,000 hours. A good friend of mine had 750, 800 hours, was a CFI, CFII, you name it. Several guys had been aviation majors in school. They had several hundred hours, commercial tickets and whatnot. And then, of course, myself, 35 hours. So I didn't have a lot of aviation experience. I always felt that I wish that I'd had more experience going into it, and I wish that I'd had some exposure to instrument flying. But, getting back to the T-34, it was exhilarating. We were all excited. And it was a hot plane, especially studying the systems. It had the Pratt & Whitney PT-6A, PT-6A, TAC 25, I believe, 550 horsepower, derated to 475. So it was a pretty snappy little plane, and we were excited to fly.
No ejection seat, obviously.
No ejection seat. Back in that platform those days, to bail out, you would have blown the canopy and gone out the hard way.
Absolutely, yeah. A little bit different mindset there. There's no handle to get you out of everything, which is...
Ball yourself up and dive for the trailing edge. If you're in a spin, dive to the outside of the turn.
Wow. So we're very fortunate, obviously, with some recent events in mind. It's a very safe... The T6 that I fly is an incredibly safe airplane, and we have two very, very... wonderful ejection seats that Martin Baker built for us, $1 million a pop in the front and in the back that can get us out of trouble. Going through the syllabus, was that something that you all ever, I don't know, was it ever, obviously it always remains in the back of everyone's mind that if you needed to get out of the airplane, I always was very, very up to date on the survival gear and understanding how to use that stuff. Was that something that ever, was it in your mind? Again, you had a little bit of aviation exposure, but it's a little bit different. You don't just pull a handle. You actually have to manually get out of the airplane. I've always thought that calculus would probably be a little bit different in terms of, if I was in that, obviously you and I both own airplanes, no ejection seats in either of them, but if something bad happens, I'm taking that airplane to the ground pretty much. I don't have a parachute that I could jump out with.
Well, I would say this, knowing what I now know, looking back at those times, it's what I didn't know. And so I don't think we ever really thought about it. We were more excited about the prospects of flying and getting up there and learning. and we wanted to get out to the fleet and do the job. We wanted to be naval aviators. So I think more than anything else, we were excited. Now, we did a number of survival training evolutions, and we all took that serious. I think the Navy and the instructors did a very good job of prioritizing the safety aspects and making it important to us. But I would say that we just weren't smart enough at that point to know what we didn't know.
Just how dangerous it was.
And to understand and fully comprehend the hazards, the risk that we were taking. So we were more excited than worried about the risk.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. Speaking of excited, that first flight in the T-34, do you remember it with any detail?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, can you tell me about that?
Ranger 757. That was the buzz number, the BUNO on the side of the aircraft. And hey, it was an exciting experience. I remember it was Corpus Christi. It was early in the year, so kind of getting out of that weather pattern towards spring. And we took off. There were a lot of gray skies, a lot of towering cumulus. And my on-wing, TV Wally Wallace, the guy was quite a character. But anyway, Wally at the controls. We took off, climbed out, course rules out over the beach, and went to one of the training areas. And so we're up flying around. And one thing I remember is he was talking me through, showing me some of the course rules and areas and whatnot. And so you can look down and see the beach line through breaks in the clouds. And he said, "Hey, look over there to the left." And he's trying to point something out to me, a land feature. And so I looked left, and I'm peering out the side of the cockpit, and he slammed the stick hard to the right. I think this is a Navy flight instructor trick that goes way back. Anyway, he slammed the stick hard to the right, and that was the commencement of a pretty thorough ringing out of that aircraft, full aerobatics. And I can't tell you what all we did. I think we did just about everything you could do with that airplane. And I think he was trying to set the tone for training and also to see if he could get me to get sick in the aircraft.
Was he successful?
He was not. I thought it was exhilarating, again, not knowing what I didn't know. And so I thoroughly enjoyed the experience. But it was a very memorable flight, and one not to be forgotten.
That's awesome. That's a super short story on my end. I had a student recently. We were doing a spin, and obviously for the student NFOs in the front seat for the flights that I'm doing, the initial contact flights, they're not at the controls. They're talking me through the maneuvers, and I'll keep it short, but basically, in the T6, you set the power, you set the nose attitude, the landing gear horn goes off, you silence that, and then it's a little bit of silence as you're essentially waiting for your AOA to increase. Basically, the nose is still climbing. You're waiting for that first indication of stall, and then you're going to put in those pro spin control inputs to start the spin, and et cetera, continue all the way around. Nice. And right as we're about to enter the spin, usually the reason I mention all that is it's usually pretty quiet. They have call-outs, they have things they need to say and do, but you're just kind of monitoring. You're waiting for airspeed to bleed. You're waiting for the airplane to enter the spin. And I got a big yee-haw from the front cockpit right as we enter the spin, and it scared the bejesus out of me because I'm not used to students necessarily always enjoying the spin that much. I love them, but nice. It kind of reminded me of, oh yeah, like they're very new at this. This is maybe the second time he's ever seen this in an airplane. And yeah, it is really freaking cool. So awesome. It was kind of a nice reminder for me. But okay, so you remember that first flight really, really well. Solo, no. Again, my track going through, we had the initial solo in the T6, an aero solo, and a form solo. So only 3. Did you guys follow? I'm guessing probably. I was told back in the day there were even more solos.
Yeah, very similar to what they do today. You'd go through about 10 flights, and then at that point, you'd have a safer solo check ride. That was always a very rigorous examination in the aircraft of everything that you were supposed to know and everything you had learned. And they wanted to make sure that you were safe and you were able to manage course rules, manage the aircraft, take off, and come back and land. Incidentally, the aircraft that I drew for my first solo flight, Ranger 757, the same exact plane. So I remember my first solo was memorable, just the standard routine stuff, taking off, going out to the working area, spend a little bit of time out there, and then return to base. We did several solos during the aerobatics, and so the next stage after FAMS, we jumped right into aerobatics. The first flight was flying with an instructor. He would go out and demo all the aerobatics. You would also fly them as well. You would come back, and then they put you on the schedule for solo aerobatics, which was pretty amazing. That number one, they were entrusting you with the aircraft, but number two, they were expecting you to go out and fly all these maneuvers. And those aerobatic flights were just so much fun and so exhilarating. And I remember those just like it was yesterday. But anyway, we had quite a few solo flights doing aerobatics.
Okay. We had in my time at Roswell, I remember we had a student that we jokingly called it Border Patrol. So I guess there were folks that going through the aero syllabus would kind of realize, hey, maybe I want to fly big wing or I want to fly helicopters. I don't necessarily want to go out and thrash an airplane around for the rest of my Navy flying career, which certainly understandable, certainly respectable. I remember a flight I was flying with the XO of our squadron in Roswell, and we were waiting and waiting. We were supposed to have his airplane, and at a certain point, this person had not come back, and it was, I'm not going to say they weren't overdue, but they were certainly past their land time. And EXO was very close to basically saying, hey, break out the mishap binder. We need to make sure we find this guy. And right as I think he was directing another flight instructor to call ATC and say, hey, where is this kid? He comes rolling in. But the reason I mention that, if you flew the Aero Solo by flying aerobatics, you would burn a little bit more fuel, right? And so you wouldn't have all that option. And I remember him very distinctly. He was a student that did not necessarily enjoy aero, which is totally fine. And so he just flew max endurance, just flew the edges of the box, which always seemed to me as a great shame. You have this awesome airplane and you can take advantage of it, but to each their own. But what I mean by that is max endurance profile. You can fly for a lot longer, and he lost track of time. And
Wow.
He was a Marine, and I remember our Marine XO, whose name I won't mention, but I love dearly, kind of took him aside, and they had a little bit of 1v1 counseling, and then he said, okay, you ready to go? I said, yes, sir. And we took the golf cart out to the airplane and went flying. So good memory of that as well. Okay, cool. So at the end of that T-34 syllabus, you're going to find out where you're, and I always say, you get to choose. You get to put names on a paper, but the Navy is choosing where they send you. Do you remember having an idea going through training where you wanted to go, what you wanted to do following the T-34? Obviously, those different pipeline selections.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So basically at the end of the primary, you do selection. And there were 3 routes at the time that you could take. You could go jets, tactical fighters. You could go props, or you could go helos. Those were the 3 selections. And everybody filled out their dream sheet, but that's just it. It was a dream sheet. At the end of the day, the Navy does, in fact, pick where you go. So we finished up primary. We'd put in our request, and selection came around, and they told us where we were going. Out of the 10 guys that graduated that week, 9 of us went helicopters. So there was a helo draft going on. That's what we called it. And the top guy in the class, he got his, I want to say his first choice, which was props.
Okay.
So we had 1 props and 9 helicopters.
And when you say props, I'm guessing props is P3.
That's right,
okay.
P3s.
Okay, so no TAC air, the 1 P3, and then, wow, that's a lot of, okay.
Yeah.
Yep, so you packed back up and headed back in this direction, back toward Pensacola.
That's right. So that was the end of primary. We did have intermediates back then. That was about 25 more hours, a lot of cross-country work.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
That's not something that I'm familiar with. Yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah, so it was mainly just building time in the aircraft. We did a lot of cross-country work. For my cross-country selection, I had wanted to go as far as I could. So I said, hey, let's go up to the Northeast, and we're going to fly all the way up to New York State. And I found an instructor to fly with me. I guess he was from there, and he was one of the guys from the wing. He was a full commander. And we ended up flying up to the Northeast, New York State, and then returning. A couple things I remember about intermediates, and those flights in particular. The first was we were over the middle of Ohio somewhere, and it's a beautiful fall day, bright, clear sunshine, and we're flying along. We're doing a low-level navigation route. And I can see my instructor through the little mirrors looking back. And it was kind of like a scene from 1941 with John Belushi. He's got his charts up, and he's trying to, keep us on track. This is before GPS, by the way. And as I'm flying along, we're flying over this little farm, and I look down. I can see this little farmhouse, and I remember it like it was yesterday. The door opened up, and this little kid, he was probably 7 or 8 years old, steps out on the back porch, and you can see the screen door slam shut, and he's looking up at us as we're flying over. And so I took the stick, and I gave him a little wing waggle as we flew over. And I remember the instructor dropping his charts and looking about, hey, is everything okay up there? And I didn't want to fess up, so I just said, oh, yeah, a little bit of turbulence or whatever I said. But anyway, it was a great moment. It's still emblazoned upon my mind, just the beauty of that day and seeing that little kid step onto that back porch. It was a very memorable moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing, and I'm looking at, obviously got a couple notes here, but you mentioned some close calls, and I'm guessing is there any in the T-34 that were memorable to you? Was that when you were going through as a student?
Yes. So a couple close calls or situations that happened coming through T-34s. We had, this was towards the end of primary. Takeoff. It was during, during formation training. We'd taken off. We were course rules outbound, had the instructor in the back, and we had some fumes in the cockpit. Ended up having to turn around, come back. And that was, there was in the electrical system, there was an inverter. And I want to say it was down right there on the firewall, just near one of your feet there in the aircraft. Anyway, that thing had caught on fire and burned up. And so we had some of those smoke fumes in the cockpit, turned around, came back. Good procedures, good return.
And you could crack the canopy in that airplane. So you have a way to actually vent a little bit of that smoke.
Yes, you could.
Okay.
Yeah. The other thing that was kind of interesting, and I ended up writing an article about this situation, was I was sitting in the back seat. We were doing basic instruments, and the instructor was sitting in the front seat. And we went to take off. Instructors flying the aircraft. As we rotated, my seat completely slid all the way to the full down position. And in this case, I'm basically sitting on the floorboards in the seat. I can't see over the center console there. So I waited. We climbed out, leveled off, course rules outbound. And I said, hey, sir, during the rotation, I said, my seat, collapsed, and I'm all the way. And I could see him kind of up there peering around, trying to look into the mirrors. And he goes, oh, man. He goes, yeah, you're completely out of sight. He goes, I'll tell you what we're going to do. He goes, on the count of 3, he goes, I want you to reach down, grab the seat latch, and I'm going to give you a little forward stick. And you push up, and we'll get you back up and seated properly. I said, roger that, sir. So he goes, 1, 2, 3. Now, I was expecting just kind of a light stick input, but he slammed the controls forward. I had pulled the latch, and whenever that happened, I went shooting up, and he goes, man, you shot up like a rocket. Anyway, I had had the foresight to release the seat latch, and so now I'm in the full up position. And I very gingerly pulled the latch, lowered myself a notch or two. I'm back in the proper placement. And so we're talking about it a little bit in the cockpit, and I kept hearing this noise, and I'm like, what in the world's going on here? So I'm looking around the cockpit. Now, when he had pushed the stick forward, I knew he pushed it forward because all of my charts and everything that were on the center console, they all floated into the air. You could see everything floating as we went -G. Anyway, I kept hearing this noise, and I'm looking around the cockpit trying to figure out what it is. I look to my left, nothing. I look to my right, and I see this little hairline crack, I believe, in the canopy. And as I'm looking up and over, I had completely cracked the canopy with my helmet. That's why you wear all the survival gear. And the canopy had separated, and there was about an inch or two gap. And so what I was hearing was all the airflow, all the air noise coming into the cockpit at that point. Anyway, I said, "Sir, you're never going to believe what happened." And he goes, "What?" And I was very quick to point out that we were both in this together. I said, "We, not me, we cracked the canopy." And he goes, "What?" And I said, "Well," when I shot up there, when you push the stick forward and I shot up, I hit the canopy with my helmet and it's cracked." And of course, at that point, there were a few expletives mentioned, and he said, "Oh gosh, we got to go back." So we wrapped it up into a tight turn, headed back for the field. Didn't declare emergency, but came in and landed. And sure enough, we had completely cracked the canopy on that.
Wow.
I ended up writing a story for Approach magazine later on.
And this is going to say this is probably when you were an instructor later on and no longer a student, I'm guessing.
That's right. I was in the fleet when I wrote that one up.
Absolutely. Yeah. Gosh. And man, I bet that was quite a hit if your head literally was or your helmet, I should say, I guess is what cracked that canopy open.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Gosh. Okay, cool. So primary, intermediate, and then back here to Whiting. Back here flying the TH-57 Bravo, so the Sea Ranger, basically a Bell 206 for those familiar.
That's right.
Awesome training helicopter. And then after that, the Charlie for the instrument. And so let me see. I want to make sure for me, it was just primary, I should say advanced flight training in the TH-57 Bravo. So you do that initial solo, and then I believe there was a tactics phase, very short, and then after that, everything else was in the Charlie. All the instrument flying, the formation flying, the ONAV, the night flying. Does that all sound pretty familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pretty standard curriculum. They call it advanced flight training. Really, it's basic helicopter. You're learning all the basics of rotor wing aviation. It was a great program and came through pretty much as described there. A couple notable situations I had. When I came up for my instrument solo, they pair you off with another flight student that's about the same level as you are. And we'd ended up doing our solo over to Keesler Air Force Base, which is just right down the coast here. And when we went over, it was a beautiful day. Clouds were building. And we get over there just in time. We landed, and this massive cell comes over the field and starts dumping on us. I mean, it was raining so hard. We had shut down. We didn't even get out of the aircraft, and we just stayed in the aircraft for like 15 minutes while it's just pouring rain on us. Anyway, that was the start of some bad weather, and we ended up getting stuck there overnight. So we stayed overnight. And the next day, obviously, we called back to base, let them know what happened to us and whatnot. And they say, "Well, hey, if you don't have the weather, men's, then stay there and figure it out." And so we got ourselves a room at the Q, and we stayed overnight. The next day, when we flew back, and it was kind of amazing, probably a lot more than the curriculum was designed for, we took off, we punched in the clouds, we flew the entire way back in hard IFR. Shot an instrument approach, made it back into the field, and that was the end of our experience. So
wow.
Talk about confidence builder. It was really nice, really neat to apply all of our instrument skills and fly in hard IFR. And looking back at the amount of experience I had at the time, I'm quite amazed at what we were able to accomplish back then.
Oh, for sure. And just to be clear, was that two solo students, so you flew the one leg, the other student flew the return leg, and you were both doing your instrument solo, or was the other one just as an observer?
Yeah, the other one was just observer co-pilot. So
okay, so you flew both instrument.
It was
wow.
both of my events. Yeah.
Okay, for us, at least when I was going through the syllabus, we called it a Brolo. It's a solo, but obviously you have another person in the aircraft. They're not supposed to make control inputs or anything, but it was the iNav out and then the VNav solo back. So they combined it that way. But if it's an instrument, whether you're coming back instruments, so
yeah,
that's really cool. And then obviously, I guess something that I haven't hit on just quite yet, I'll jump a little bit forward, and then I'll come right back to the present. But you obviously went through API, went through advanced flight training in the TH-57, and then came back as an instructor in both those. And so I'll get to that later, but one thing that I'm really curious to see is your perspective seeing it from the other side, seeing it as an instructor, as opposed to just seeing. A lot of times I look back and realize my perspectives or opinions are very, very different when you see it from the other side of the table. So I'm curious to see if that's the same for you, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So after that, what was selection like when it was at the end of your time at advanced flight training? What were the options for helicopters that you could go fly on the different coasts? And then where'd you end up ultimately going?
Okay. So I finished the program in September of 97. and graduated at that time. Back in those days, there was about 15 selection choices that you had. You had several different platforms. One of the big ones was LAMPS, which is the Light Airborne Multipurpose System. And that was flying the H-60, SH-60. And, of course, you when you came up for selection, you were picking a couple items. Number one was the platform or the mission. And then number two was the location. And based on all of the platforms, all of the locations, again, equated to about 15 selection items. My first choice was CH-53s over in Sicily. And that was kind of, I picked that for personal reasons. I wanted to go see that part of the world. I had studied a lot of Greek history in college, and I thought, man, that would be great to be right there in the middle of the Mediterranean, be in Sicily. I'll be able to travel to Europe and Greece and everything else.
And that would have been HC4, right, at that time?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Since gone away, obviously.
So that was my first choice. Beyond that, I started picking kind of mission platform. I ended up getting my fifth choice out of 15, and that was HSL-51, flying the mighty SH-60B Seahawk out of Atsugi, Japan.
Wow. So where was the, and again, I'm using too many acronyms, the FRS, where was the training squadron for the 60 Bravo?
Okay. Basically, they had two squadrons that did training, East Coast, West Coast. Because of my fleet squadron, HSL-51, being in Atsugi, Japan, I was slated to go to the FRS, Fleet Replacement Squadron, at HSL-41 in San Diego.
Okay. What was San Diego like? I assume that was probably your first time being out on the West Coast?
So let's see. Backing up, I graduated. That was September of 97. Naval Aviator, 24834, which I think is pretty cool. And it was a great ceremony. My parents got to come see that. And my dad, who's an old pilot, was able to pin on my wings. So
that's wonderful. You said old pilot. What did he fly?
So my dad was an agricultural pilot. He was a crop duster.
That's awesome. What kind of Pawnees?
Oh, he's flown them all.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really, really neat.
Okay. So then let's see. We went out to HSL-41. That was the Fleet Replacement Squadron, flying the SH-60B. It was a pretty lengthy curriculum. I want to say about 8 months or so. They start out, you have FAMs, so learning how to fly the aircraft. Of course, that's all predicated by ground school and learning all the systems and whatnot. But anyway. So you go to the ground school, learn all about the aircraft. You start out flying FAMs, and then you get into a lot of tactics and simulation and simulators and whatnot. Very lengthy program. It was a good time. It was great to be a winged aviator at that point, but it was a lot of hard study, and it was great to be in San Diego. And, of course, at that point, we were all looking forward to getting out to our fleet squadron and doing the mission there. So great group of guys as far as the students that were out there. You made a lot of lifelong friends out there, and the instructors were great, very professional, and a wealth of knowledge. So it was a great experience.
Absolutely. And one thing I do want to, again, back up and make sure I talk through is you talked about LAMPS and the LAMPS mission. I'm hoping you could talk through that. But the missions for the 60 Bravo, and I'll read it off the resume here: anti-submarine warfare, anti-ship warfare, search and rescue, vertical war punishment, communications relay, PAX mail cargo transfer, and then special operations support missions. So a lot that aircraft can do. What was it like stepping up from the TH-57? It's a capable aircraft, but it's not nearly a 60. What was it like making that step up into the 60 and that first gray helicopter for you?
Yeah, it was a huge step, and all you have to do is kind of compare and contrast those aircraft side by side to understand what a big step that was. The TH-57 is a light aircraft, single engine, relatively small airframe, very limited in how much it can lift in terms of usable weights and whatnot. When you turn around and look at the SH-60, again, this is the Navy's version of the Black Hawk helicopter. It's a very imposing airframe, 64.5 feet long, max gross weight somewhere in the neighborhood of 24,000 pounds, multi-engine. The TH-57 had 425 horsepower, shaft horsepower, turbine engine made by Allison. The SH-60 had two GE T700 401 Charlies. So, and it could produce almost 2,000 horsepower side. So the difference between those two aircraft was pretty astounding. It was a very imposing plane, very complex, a lot of missions, a lot of things to know. So it was a real learning curve stepping from the TH-57 to the H-60.
Gotcha. And the LAMPS mission itself, just for those that, I'll be honest, I'm not even familiar with exactly what LAMPS stands for and what the mission is.
So Light Airborne Multi-Purpose System. This was for all intents and purposes, a Cold War aircraft. Its original design concept was to find and destroy enemy submarines. So with that in mind, it was optimized for anti-submarine work. We had a lot of processors and computer systems in the back of the aircraft. The principal means of finding a submarine back, say, during a Cold War scenario, blue water operations, would be to go out and to lay down a pattern of sonobuoys. Now, keep in mind, we're working within the context of the broader fleet, so we're also working with P-3 Orions, also working with our ship and other platforms to find and localize submarines. But once we had a good lead on where we thought submarines would be, we'd go out and we'd lay a pattern of sonobuoys. And there's several different kinds of sonobuoys. They're pretty complex devices, but in essence, what they are microphones that you place in the water. The upper portion of the sonobuoy would float, and it had an antenna. So we could basically transmit to the sonobuoy, giving it commands, and also getting information from the sonobuoy. And we were listening for enemy submarines. Submarines, as they transmit through the water, create quite a bit of noise, either flow noise coming over the hull or the internal noises that are made by the machinery of the vessel itself. And that's what we're listening for. Once we could detect some noise that was emanating from the submarine, at that point we could determine a bearing and a range from the sonobuoy. And it all comes down to triangulation. So you're listening, you hear something, say off to your left, you think it's this far away, or maybe you don't even know the distance. Then at that point you put in another sonobuoy, and again you start to listen with that sonobuoy, you tune it up, and you get a bearing to the submarine from that buoy. At some point those lines are going to intersect, or you put in another buoy so that you do have some type of intersection. And then over time you can detect the Doppler shift of those bearing lines and detect the movement of the submarine. So very complex type of warfare. I found it very intriguing. I thought it was the ultimate hunt. The submarine, those guys are fighting for their lives. They have a number of tactics and tricks that they can employ to evade us. But we're trying our hardest to find them. And it was interesting work. It was really pretty neat. Very technological and advanced form of warfare. And anyway, that was our bread and butter. That was our principal mission.
Okay.
We could also do anti-ship work, and at that time, a lot of that was queuing our own ship so that they could fight against the enemy ship. So we had a data link, which was a very narrow beam that would go from our ship to our aircraft, and we were in constant communication with them. We could use our sensors. We had a radar, the APS 124 radar, and we had several different modes. We could look for a surface contact. Once we detected something, we could send that information back to our ship. They could use that as targeting data for enemy ship if there was a surface engagement, etc. So that was a really fun and interesting mission as well. At the time, we had the Penguin missile. That was IR seeker head designed to, destroy a ship. We were also coming out with and obtaining the Hellfire missile to use in the anti-ship role. So again, we were a well-armed platform and very capable of doing anti-submarine work.
That's awesome. Going back to the aircraft itself, so obviously 2 folks up front, a helicopter aircraft commander, and then a co-pilot. And that can be 2 hacks. It can be, actually, backing up, did you guys ever do 2P flights?
Okay, so that was something on the books that we could do, but it wasn't common practice.
Okay, same, yes.
Yeah, and I think we did one 2P flight before, say, a hack board,
really?
just as kind of a confidence builder.
Okay.
But they were not very prevalent, and the COs were very reluctant to award that to young junior crews.
I think it was the same thing for us. It was in the books, but we never had 2 co-pilots go out and fly a 53. It was always there was always enough aircraft commanders to put in the other seat. So.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the cost of these platforms. Some of these helicopters that we would fly, I mean, they literally would be one of 8 in the inventory. I mean, they were rare because they were very technologically advanced, and some of the prices would be in excess of $50 million.
Wow, per airframe. Okay,
per airframe.
That's incredible. So the 2 of you up front, and then who do you have in the back of the aircraft? Because you mentioned we. Obviously, this is a team sport, not just you and the ship and other airborne assets, but you guys in the actual helicopter itself. You're leading a team. Who are the other the enlisted aircrew members that are in the back actually working the different sensors and systems? That's
right. So the way the SH-60B was manned is you had the cockpit and you had 2 air crewmen up there, pilots. You would have the aircraft commander, and then you would have the second pilot. In the left side, the left seat, was the station for what we call the ATO, Airborne Tactical Officer. And again, that could either be the aircraft commander or the co-pilot. But that was the ATO sitting in the left seat, and then the pilot sitting in the right seat. In the back of the aircraft, you had one primary station for an air crewman, and we called that the sensor operator. The sensor operator was manning all those computer systems that we were talking about earlier, helping to tune up sonobuoys and that type of thing. So they were very highly trained, very experienced, and just great crewmen to have on board the aircraft. Now, if we're going to do something like search and rescue, then we'd have a rescue swimmer on board the aircraft. So depending on the mission, typically 3 crewmen on board the aircraft or possibly 4.
Okay, makes sense. Back to kind of the tools and technologies. The sonobuoys, and I want to make sure everyone's kind of clear on it, it's a single-use, I don't want to say weapon, but a single-use system, right? You launch that sonobuoy, it's in the water, you're not getting it back.
That's right.
You have a limited number, and I guess if I could do the math, I could figure out how many are on the side of a 60 Bravo, but can you reload those in flight, or once they're gone, they're gone?
Yeah. So we actually had a sonobuoy launcher in the aircraft. It was, in my personal estimation, an overly complex and limited system. But these sonobuoy launchers basically look like holes in the side of the aircraft. It was on the port side of the aircraft, or left side of the plane. And I want to say, gosh, I haven't thought about this for years, but we could carry about 25 sonobuoys.
Okay.
And we would load them up according to the mission profile. And again, there were about just shy of a dozen different types of sonobuoys. Everything from passive sensors, where you're just listening, to active sonobuoys, where you could actually ping, and you could actively try to generate noise from the submarine. Now, when you think about that, using sonar, it's kind of like a radar for detecting aircraft, okay? You're transmitting sound into the medium of the ocean, and you're listening for the reflection of that sound. But this is something that's very rarely done, because if you were to ping an enemy submarine, at that point, they think an attack is imminent, so they will respond accordingly.
Really? Okay.
That's right.
So my limited understanding based on The Hunt for Red October and The Hunt for Red October only.
Great movie.
Actually, okay, so now that I'm speaking to someone that understands this, how accurate is any of that?
Well, it's like anything else Hollywood.
Yeah, okay.
It's a great movie. It's a great idea. Hey, the Cold War, those were very heady times. There was a lot of competition in terms of technological development and making all these wonderful weapon systems, but the harsh reality is that those things were made for war. And to use those weapon systems would have probably meant that the end was imminent. So anyway, it was a great movie, very entertaining.
There's a 60 in that movie, as I recall.
That's right.
Yeah.
Our platform, the 60 Bravo, is in that movie. That moment where James Earl Jones pushes the button and says, "I was never here and this never happened." Yeah. Then they show the quick clip of the SH-60 flying over and dropping the torpedo, and so I think we've got credit for sinking the Red October.
Yeah, exactly.
Our claim to fame.
That's on someone's fit rep, I'm sure, at a minimum. I just learned one ping only, and that's all. Okay, so speaking about the ship itself and landing on the ship, was the first time you landed on the ship in the 60? And the only reason I mention that, and again, I'm not trying to date you, I know kind of Pensacola lore, the Baylander was a small ship that actually would putz around in the bay here just south of NAS Pensacola, and the TH-57s, the training helicopters, would land on them. I know it went away, I want to say sometime in the 90s or maybe a little bit later than that. Did you ever go to the boat, big air quotes here, in a 57, or was it for the first time in the 60?
No. Yeah, I went to the boat right here.
Really?
In the
Okay.
bay.
Yeah, well, tell me about the Baylander.
Yeah, it was, and we never called it the Baylander. It was India X-Ray 514, and it was basically a barge with a flight deck on it. And I've actually got some photos of my landing coming aboard there. It was a great experience. A little bit canned in that, hey, India X-Ray is out there in Pensacola Bay. The conditions are relatively benign, and you're landing during the daytime, which was nothing like what you would experience in the fleet. When we got to HSL 41, the FRS, that's when we did we call them DLQs, deck landing qualification. That was towards the end of our program there. And hey, we're operating blue water out there in the middle Pacific, and we would go out and do a series of daytime landings and then nighttime landings. And so you talk about maybe a grade school type of event here in the Bay, Pensacola Bay, and varsity level when you got out there to the blue water operations.
Do you think we lost anything obviously we lost something, but by sunsetting that capability and the first time anyone touches a boat in the helicopter world is in a gray aircraft, in a fleet aircraft, was that an actual loss to training, or was it something that, like you said, it was that very junior level look?
Yeah. In my humble estimation, yes, we did.
Okay.
And I say that is that, again, it's a very costly enterprise trying to train up a fleet aviator. And I understand that costs accrue and they add up, and we do need to be very conscientious of those costs. But I would just say this, and again, not to get political or anything, but you're never going to get cheaper than operating a single-engined aircraft, a light training aircraft, in these type of conditions, in the training command. And this is where you really need to lay the foundation, okay? Because when you get up to the fleet and you're flying more complex aircraft, number one, you're taken away from that mission, but the training costs don't go down at that point. So yes, I would say we did lose something when we sunsetted that program.
Gotcha. Yeah, again, a little tangential story. I have a friend who flew Little Birds in the Army, and that was his first time landing on a ship. As an Army guy, they flew down from Fort Campbell, deaded out of NAS Pensacola, and went to the Baylander. And sorry, that's the only terminology I know
that's
for it.
That's
okay. Yeah, and so even for them, that was their first look at, and obviously in the real world, he did significantly more than that. But it was the first time just to put the skids down on a moving ship at sea, even, yes, if it's in the daytime and it's in beautiful Pensacola Bay.
That's right.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah, it was a great program, and I thought it brought a lot to the training, and so yes, I did get to go through that when I was.
Do you remember how many bounces? Was it just the one, or was it 3, or was there a little syllabus, I'm sure, tied to it? FCLPs at first and then DLQs.
I haven't thought about this for a long time. I want to think it was somewhere in the nature of 6 landings. I mean, we did quite a few.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and that included probably several approaches, landing, picking back up, and landing again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Very cool. Okay, so we're talking about the fleet. So going to Japan, what was that like?
Yeah. So I went out after the FRS, HSL 41 in San Diego. I went out to Atsugi, Japan, which is right outside of Tokyo, Yokohama. And I did my fleet tour with HSL 51, the Mighty Warlords. I got out there, I reported for duty. That was July of 98. And I was out there until July of 01. So standard 3-year tour. Anyway, it was a great experience being out there. It was an absolutely great command. We had a great O Club on base. Again, you make lifelong friends with the people you serve with. But we were very much a seagoing operation. We had a high mission rate, and we supported all the ships for 7th Fleet. And we had 7 permanently stood up detachments. And so we were a very busy squadron. And we found ourselves at sea. In fact, out of my 3-year tour, I probably have just shy of 2.5 years at sea time from that.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Pretty amazing.
Yes. I didn't even spend that much time deployed to the island of Bahrain in that. Holy moly. Okay, wow. How many aircraft in the squadron if you guys maintain 7 dets continually? That's got to be a lot of helicopters.
Yeah, I want to say we had 12 H-60s. And then we also had another det that supported 7th Fleet. That was the Admiral. And those were H-3s. So we had 2 H-3s, kind of a composite squadron. But they kind of fell under our wings. Totally different mission for those guys, but they were one of the 7 dets.
Okay, and that wouldn't be a white top, but it was a VIP H-3, so they weren't actually doing any kind of anti-submarine warfare, any kind of...
Negative.
Just moving the boss, basically.
Yeah,
okay.
Carting around the Admiral.
Wow, that's interesting having 2 different types under the same squadron. I'm trying to think of... Okay, sure. VFA 106 has FA-18Es and FA-18Fs, 2 different types under the same squadron, but I mean 2 different literally an H-3 and a 60 are 2 different aircraft. That's interesting.
Yeah, basically consider that to be a mini squadron, if you will.
Okay.
That kind of fell under our command and control. But those guys did a whole different program, and they were part of our squadron, but a whole different mission set, and so they were on different deployment schedules, etc.
And that's interesting because now you look at the way that we manage aircraft and the way that we manage, I don't know, the Naval Aviation Enterprise, I guess is the big fancy term for it. If the Admiral needs to get moved, we'll put him in a light gray Sierra or even a Romeo. There's just one of those fleet aircraft. There's not a dedicated VIP rotary wing support, maybe other than HMX-1, I guess you'd say, for POTUS or the Vice President, that type of a mission set. But very interesting. Okay, cool. So kind of stepping back, first deployment, I'm guessing it sounds like lots of shorter deployments. Is that kind of the out for a period of months and then back for not that long, obviously? But
that's right. So when you consider that we were forward deployed as we were over in Japan, we did a lot of short fused deployments and a lot of shorter deployments. And what I mean by that is it was not uncommon for us to get underway and go out for 10 days, 2 weeks. That was pretty common to just sortie out. And basically our squadron supplied aircraft and personnel to any ship in 7th Fleet. So anytime one of those ships was getting underway, then we would be on board.
okay.
But shorter deployments, anywhere from 10 to 14 days. I would say our average deployment was maybe a month and a half. The longest stint that I did out there was just over 3 months. And that was considered to be a long deployment for us. Now, keep in mind, once we came back to Atsugi, we'd come back, we'd bring the aircraft back. We were always doing intensive maintenance on the aircraft, keeping them up and operating. We'd be back for a period of time and then basically reloading, getting ready to go back out to sea. So it was a very, very high mission rate, and it was very vigorous on our part.
Maybe a meaningless metric, but I'm always curious. From check-in to making 2P, how long? Any idea? A couple months, 6 months? So
the interesting thing about getting to a fleet squadron is that at the end of your training in advanced, you got your wings. You're a designated naval aviator. And I think one of the common misconceptions is, hey, that's it. You're a winged aviator, no more training. But you show up at the FRS, the Fleet Replacement Squadron, and you immediately go right into a training curriculum learning your aircraft. Then, when you get to your fleet squadron, you are a PQM, Pilot Qualified in Model, okay? The training does not end there. The progression does not end there. At that point, you continue to train. Your first step is to make H2P, which is a helicopter second pilot or a co-pilot. And then from there, you become aircraft commander, helicopter aircraft commander, HAC, and then a maintenance pilot. It was kind of interesting to me when I checked in. First thing they hand you is, hey, welcome aboard. Here's the curriculum for making 2P. And it was a lot of reading, a lot of studying. I want to say we had probably somewhere in the neighborhood of a dozen flights to do. And so you immediately started the curriculum to make H2P. And that would usually, depending on deployment schedules and whatnot, that would take you several months to do. Then from there, once you become a 2P, you immediately start on your HAC syllabus, and that would take you probably, I don't know, say within about a year. The thing about the HAC syllabus, again, because our community had so many missions, there was a lot of tactical pubs that we needed to be cognizant of, a lot of studying. In fact, I always wanted to do this. I always wanted to take all the publications that we had to have read and be cognizant of and stack them up, because I would venture to say you're looking at about 5 to 6 feet of publications that you had to know. It was a lot of material. To become an aircraft commander, they would do not only a check ride in the aircraft, and we did those annually with our NATOPS checks, but we also, it was required that you do a board. And in the board, you would have all of the higher-ups from the squadron. So you had the CO, the XO, then they would have your detachment OIC, you'd have the NATOPS officer in there, and probably several other hacks. And you would basically sit at the big table. The rules were that you could take whatever you would take into the aircraft with you, so your checklist and whatnot. Typically, we call those our blue brains. You take your checklist with you, and I think they would allow you some sheets of paper, like on your knee board, and a pen. And they would just hammer you with questions to make sure that you knew all of the aspects of the aircraft and how to conduct a mission, and they wanted to make sure that you could safely do all of that.
Any good hack board stories? And the reason I asked that is I think one of the greatest things for me was studying for, and we did, actually there's a couple differences between what you just described and the way we did it at HM15 in my time there. But first off, COXO were not in on the board. If you failed a board, your next one, XO chaired it. If you failed another board, Skipper chaired it, and that was the last one. So that's kind of an interesting shift in the philosophy, I guess, there. But I so much enjoyed being on the other side of the table, not for obvious reasons. You're not the one under the scrutiny, but trying to gauge someone's mental process and trying to, okay, you're saying these words to me right now. We're at 0 knots and 1G sitting behind a conference room table, but I'm also testing, would you really do that? Would you really say that? And of course, you'd probably flown with those people. Did you ever, I'm jumping back and forth here, your time at the squadron, but did you ever get to sit on boards and kind of see it from a different perspective?
Yeah, so I think in a nutshell, the whole purpose of the board is they want to figure out your mental processes, and they want to know about your ADM, aeronautical decision making. Studying, preparing for the board, well, theoretically, everything you did from stepping your foot in the door until that board process was training for the board, okay? But there was a lot of material to go over, and I remember preparing for the board. Number one, it was a lot of material. Basically, you would go to work, you'd work all day, you'd come home, you'd study for, hours and hours, usually till about midnight. You get up the next morning, go back to work, come home, study. And of course, Then you have deployment schedules, and you're going out being deployed. You're living on the ship doing the mission. When you're not doing the mission, you had a ground job. That took up a lot of your time. And then when you weren't doing all that, you were expected to study. So it was a stressful time trying to prepare for the board. I remember coming down to the final couple weeks. One of my strategies was to build up my checklist and make sure that I had as much material and information in my checklist and that I was well organized. And keep in mind that because we had tactics, one of my checklists was classified. So I had a classified checklist, and then I had my standard checklist for just operating the aircraft. But I wanted to make sure that I had really good checklists and blue brains that I could take with me into the board. So I spent an inordinate amount of time preparing those. But anyway, luckily for me, just a farm boy from Missouri, University of Missouri graduate, public school graduate, I was able to pass my board. And it was quite a sense of accomplishment to make it past that board. And I think a big step to do so.
Your first time signing for the aircraft. Do you remember that? Was it on the boat? Was it at shore, back at Atsugi?
Yes, I do. And let me tell you, going out to sea and flying with a lot of aircraft commanders, as you become a senior 2P, second pilot or co-pilot, you get to be pretty salty. And you get to where you know the aircraft very well, and there's a lot of stuff you're willing to do and whatnot. And you kind of get tired of flying with, say, a junior hack and guys that are, and you question their decisions at times. And so I didn't fully understand until I passed my hack board, and now I'm signing for the aircraft. It is a huge paradigm shift. You go from very salty, very much willing to do anything that aircraft can do, and now you're signing for the aircraft, and it's your plane. Your sense of comfort level diminishes to right around you. I mean, very small. And it'd be like, hey, what are you doing over there? Don't touch that. This is my aircraft.
Yeah.
And a quick little sea story that was pretty funny. I was flying with, I was a brand new hack, flying with a lieutenant commander. And we're just doing a fam flight around Tokyo, Yokohama. I mean, it's a beautiful place to fly. Urban area. I mean, buildings as far as the eye can see. Lights at night. It was pretty amazing. And we're flying near Tokyo Bay. And there's the big Bay Bridge that goes across from Yokohama to Tokyo. This big span bridge. And the lieutenant commander I'm flying with says, hey, let's fly under that bridge. And it's one of those things where you're like, what in the world is this guy doing? Is he trying to test me here? What is he doing? So I said, okay, yeah, let's fly under the bridge. And he goes, okay, I'll take the controls. I said, well, hold on a second. I said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to fly back to base. We'll get maintenance to come out with a book. We'll get an A sheet. I'll sign the aircraft over to you. We'll relaunch. Then we'll come back and fly under that bridge. Meaning, hey, we're not doing it if I'm the aircraft commander and I've signed for this, but you want to sign for this and you're the lieutenant commander on board. At the time I was a lieutenant. I'll go along for that ride. It would be a great story to tell.
I'm guessing he did not take you up on that
No,
offer.
he didn't take me up on that offer.
Yeah, that could end very poorly.
Yes.
For sure. Okay, wow. Small decks or big decks? Because obviously there are some carriers out in 7th Fleet, but I'm not really familiar with where you spent most of your time. Was it a bit of a mix, or? Yeah,
so our community at the time, we would deploy on the small decks primarily. So cruisers, destroyers, frigates.
Okay.
Going over to the carrier was a real treat. We enjoyed flying off the big deck, the carrier. It was an easy day getting onto the big deck. In fact, a lot of times you'd fly over to the carrier and you were quite amazed at how stable the deck was, how little it moved. I mean, don't get me wrong, the deck's still moving. How much space you had to land. It was just fun flying over to the carrier. Coming aboard our ships, on the other hand, was a little bit different prospect. The ships were smaller. The ships were narrow. They were designed for speed, maneuverability. All that to say, they really moved around in the waves. So they would pitch and roll. And during the daytime, not too bad. Depending on sea state, you had a lot of visual cues coming aboard. Easy day. At night, on the other hand, totally different story. You literally were flying an instrument approach all the way to the back of the ship. In a tactical environment, the ships had very little lighting that was visible from the ship. You had some deck edge lights. We called them dustpan lights. You had a few other lighting systems that were glide slope indicator, HARS bars. So you had some lights that were designed for aviation purposes, but very little lighting and very little visual cues when flying aboard at night. The one thing that impressed me the most is when you get over the ocean and it's nighttime, especially if you have several layers of overcast, it is so dark. I mean, it's palpable. It's like being in a cave. There is no outside reference. You don't know the orientation of the aircraft. So it's complete reliance on your instruments. It's instrument flying all the time. When you would line up for approach, you would basically just see a little thumbnail size dot of lights. That was the ship. That's where you're going back to. And just this wide expanse of inky blackness. So you'd fly an instrument approach, and it was all hands on deck. The entire crew flying that approach. You'd have the flying pilot. He's on an instrument scan. Non-flying pilots backing him up, also scanning outside for the ship. The crewman in the back, he's backing everybody else up, monitoring an altimeter, monitoring distance to the ship, monitoring airspeed, and everybody's giving you information as the flying pilot. You also had on board the ship the landing signal officer, and he's watching that approach to make sure that you're not getting low or getting off parameters. Anyway, you would fly an instrument approach, and the technique that I developed is to just stay on the instruments, fly an instrument approach until the non-flying pilot would call out that we were over the wake, coming over the fantail of the ship. At that point, you start to make that transition from flying on instruments to looking out and acquiring the ship. And again, it's just kind of that eerie glow, very soft lighting, not a lot of visual cues. In high sea states where you have a lot of waves and the ship is really rocking, it is very challenging to come on board.
And this is all aided, correct?
No.
This is unaided.
This is unaided.
Good Lord.
This is back before the time of NVGs, my friend.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And for some reason in my silly brain, I just assumed the ship was lit up like a Christmas tree because there were no aids. So you still had the lights dim and you were doing this Mark I motto eyeball.
That's right.
Holy moly. Okay.
Yeah, I was just before the era of NVGs. In fact, our command was just starting to get them as I was getting ready to leave.
Wow. That's incredible. The 60 cockpit itself, let's say you mentioned pilot at the controls, pilot not at the controls. Did you have a good scan? Was that instrument panel really high up, or could you from the left seat, for example, see the ship just as well as from the right seat?
Yeah, so I would say both seats had a pretty good view of both the instrument panel and as well as the ship. Both stations. Airborne Tactical Officer on the left, pilot on the right. Both stations had primary instruments and references right in front of them, so you wouldn't have to fly basically cross cockpit.
Okay.
You had everything that you needed. One instrument that was very important to us was the radar altimeter. Basically, this is a radar mounted on the bottom of the aircraft, shoots a radar beam down, bounces off the surface, comes right back to the aircraft. It's a very accurate instrument that will tell you precisely how high you are off the water. Now, there are some limitations with that. For example, high sea state with big waves. You might see, hey, you're at 20 feet. Now you're at 50 feet, 20 feet, 50 feet. Hey, you got 30-foot waves underneath you. Or if you wrapped it up into a turn, now that radar beam is going out at an angle, and so that's showing you slant range. You might be at 50 feet, but it tells you you're at 100 feet. Well, hey, it's picking up waves that are 100 feet off to your side, not necessarily below you. So that was a very important instrument. But yeah, we had good instrumentation on board the aircraft, and then pretty good visibility from the cockpit over the glare shield.
Gotcha. And the reason I mentioned that in the 53, there's no better way to scare a hack if you're the co-pilot than to be coming in quick on the ship. So I think one of the gauge numbers we'd use at 1 DME, and you're using obviously the TACAN on the ship. So it's basically like a VOR. It's I'm using too many acronyms here. It's a navigational aid that's sending out data.
Yep.
On land. It'd be a VOR, VORTAC.
Tactical air navigation.
Yep, TACAN on a ship. And obviously some Navy bases have TACANs for training purposes. But the point is 1 DME, so 1 mile essentially from the, to keep it simple, 1 mile from the ship, no faster than 100 knots. 0.9, no faster than 90 knots. 0.8, no faster than 80. Yeah. Anything inside 40, at that point you need to be outside looking anyway. But if you were cruising for a bruising and coming in with a lot of speed, nothing's better than being, you mentioned the ATO, the pilot in the left seat, the ship's on the right side, the co-pilot's in the right seat, and then they throw in a huge, they bring the stick back. So they bring that nose high, and now because of the kind of the glare shield, the cockpit design in the 53, I in the left seat cannot see anything. I just know there's a ship out there, you're too fast, and you're putting in a giant correction to slow me down, and that is not a comfortable feeling, right. Especially at night. So it's not that I did that much in the 53 at night, but I could only imagine the 60 cockpit benefited from the, I'm going to test my memory here, but obviously both Sikorsky products, the 53 and the 60, but that cockpit design has gotten better over the years. I would imagine the 60 is, that great visibility is so critical, especially down at that forward right or forward left quarter, depending on the seat you're in. Looking through the chin bubble of the ship at night was interesting.
Yeah, the biggest thing there, again, was the environment we're flying at night, over the water, and just no outside visual references, and pretty good instrumentation in the 60, as I mentioned. We would fly a standard profile, typically to the back of the cruiser. It was a straight up the stern approach. You would start the approach at 1.2 nautical miles and 400 feet, and I'm trying to remember the airspeeds, but probably just shy of 100 knots. And it's a constant glide slope right back to over the flight deck, and slightly decelerating as you're coming aboard. So again, as you mentioned there, decelerating as you're coming onto the ship.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. First, and I think I'd asked about this before, and I let it run away from me. First deployment, was it a cruiser? Was it a destroyer? Probably not a CVN, but what was that first time as a hack? You're signed off. You're allowed to go do the mission. Obviously still very new. It's a license to learn. But I don't know, my one deployment when I was fully qualified was very memorable to me. I'm assuming it was probably the same for you.
Yeah. My first at-sea period was aboard the USS Cushing, which was an old Spruance class destroyer. And, it was an older ship. It was definitely showing its age. And I remember the first time coming aboard, looking down and seeing the rust streaks on the flight deck and the side of the ship. And I'm like, oh, man. Anyway, it was a good ship, and we were doing some operations off the coast of Korea. But the ships that I served on, like I said, cruisers, destroyers, frigates, got to fly off basically all the ships that were out there at 7th Fleet at the time. One of the ships that I spent most of my time aboard was the USS Mobile Bay. That was a cruiser. Also got to land aboard the USS Vincennes, which is a notable ship, historic ship, and what happened in the Persian Gulf there with that vessel.
So that was obviously after that ship had been refitted, repaired, and returned to service.
That's right.
Okay. And just to be clear, for those not familiar, it was struck by an Iraqi missile operating in the Persian Gulf, or am I remembering ship names wrong here? That might be the Stark?
Yeah, you're thinking of the Stark.
I'm thinking of the Stark.
It was the USS Vincennes that shot down the airliner.
Yeah, that's right, the Iranian airliner. Okay, sorry.
But let's see, also flew off the USS Chancellorsville. There were a number of DDGs. Those are destroyers, 51 class destroyers. Now, the interesting thing about those ships is that instead of doing a straight up the stern approach, it was an angled approach, say, for example, starboard to port approach.
Yep.
And the flight deck was angled, angled kind of in a forward down fashion, if you will. The trick there is when you landed aboard a DDG, you had to make sure to have the parking brake set. Otherwise, as soon as you touched down, the aircraft would start to roll forward.
Oh, my.
And you didn't have a lot of clearance, and you would hit the brake. So, with the rotor system. So, it was just one of those things.
Sorry, just to be clear, you said you would hit the brake with the rotor system.
That's right. Because when you look at the design of the ship, you have the flight deck, and again, it's a sloping deck forward.
Okay.
And then they call it the brake, and that's where there's a bulkhead and then the next deck coming up.
Okay.
So we call that the brake. And then, of course, they've got the missile, the VLS, and everything up there, and the superstructure of the ship.
Okay, so you would literally hit, your rotor system would hit the ship. Not good.
Yeah.
No, you can't.
Yeah,
yeah,
if
absolutely.
If you landed, there was enough angle on that flight deck that the aircraft would immediately start to roll forward.
Okay.
Okay. So that's why coming aboard a DDG, you always want to make sure to have the parking brake set.
Yeah, a lot of little differences from my very limited experience landing on ships in the 53. We always landed with the parking brake engaged, no matter what ship it was. That was part of the ship to shore or shore to ship checklist, was either setting or disengaging the parking brake.
Same for us.
Okay. And then,
but it's most critical on that platform.
Of course. Okay. The only ship I think I've ever done a up the stern approach was the Cardigan Bay, a British RFA, Royal Fleet Auxiliary ship. Everything else has been port to starboard or starboard to port. So I'm guessing maybe that became the standard as time went on because, again, not to date you, some of the ships you've mentioned I've never even heard of. I know are certainly long out of the inventory. Was that something that I guess I'm asking you a question you might not know the answer to, but as history has progressed, that design, either it's a CVN, a big deck, or it's some kind of a carrier or destroyer where it's a port to starboard, starboard to port. Even supply ships, it was the same style approach that I was used to doing as well.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I think it's all predicated, the type of approach that you do to the back of the ship. It's all predicated on the design of the ship. When you look at the aft portion of the flight deck on a DDG, there's some gear back there, some tackle that they would use, for example, if they had to tow another ship. I think there was a great big winch type apparatus back there and stuff. And that's why they want you to do the starboard to port approach typically.
Keep you out of the way of that gear.
Yes, exactly. Okay. All of the cruisers, destroyers, frigates that we landed on, that was straight up the stern approach. It's an easier approach, especially at night. And yeah, it's just a little easier because remember, when you're flying a, say, starboard to port approach, the ship's moving forward and you're coming at an angle. So you're coming towards the ship and you're flying to the right, if you will.
Correct.
So it's really good to have visual cues, especially during the daytime, so you can keep track of the ship and they don't sail off and leave you, end up in the water.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
The RAST system, was that something that the Bravo was capable of using?
That's right.
Okay. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we had a RAST system, and the whole design of this was to help in the ground handling of the aircraft once it had landed aboard. Okay. If you look at footage of, say, World War II aircraft, the planes come in and land, they shut down the engine. Hey, who's moving the aircraft on the ship? Well, 60 sailors coming all around the aircraft, pushing on that aircraft is what's moving the aircraft. The RAST stood for, it's an acronym, stands for Rapid Assist, Securing, and Traversing. And basically what it is it's a small box that probably stuck up, I would say, probably 6 inches. It's open, and so it's just the shape of a box. I would say maybe 3 feet by 4 feet in size dimension. And you would land. We had a probe that would come down from the aircraft, and you would land with the probe inside this box. Then you had a couple beams inside the RAST system that would slam shut, latching onto this probe, and from there you were able to move the RAST system on a track into the hangar. And the whole idea was to provide the motive force to move the aircraft into the hangar and then to respot the aircraft onto the flight deck. It's hard to describe, but if anybody wants to look this up and Google it, RAST system, they're still using that on some of our ships today.
Interesting. For some reason in my mind, I thought it was something that was engaged in a low hover over like you would lower, the helicopter would lower something down to the surface of the ship, and it almost helped pull the helicopter down. This is clearly a misunderstanding on my part.
Well, and that is one of the things that we would use in heavy sea state is we would actually use cable to help draw us into the RAST system if, say, the ship was in a high sea state and really rocking and pitching. You basically would drop a messenger cable. They would affix another cable. They would pull it up into the probe, essentially, and then they would use the winch system below the flight deck to winch the aircraft onto the deck. Again, this was a system very complex. It would be used in very rough weather.
Wow. Okay, so on these different ships, the destroyer, the cruiser, obviously it depends, different flight deck, different configurations. Usually a det of one helicopter, two helicopters. I guess it just depends on the ship itself, correct?
Yeah, it depends on the ship, but we would go out in 1 to 2 aircraft dets.
Okay.
Typical det would probably be one aircraft with a crew of about, I would say, 22 to 24 guys to man it. So you'd have one aircraft, 2 air crews, several crewmen, and then about 20, 22 maintainers. If you went out with 2 aircraft, we always said, hey, you got 1 good aircraft and a full set of spares. But usually
the puck on wheels.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Usually you'd plus that up by another set of air crew and a few more air crewmen and a few extra maintainers. So probably about 30 guys on board the ship for the 2 aircraft.
Okay. You mentioned the Penguin missile. Did you ever get to shoot one?
I did not.
Okay.
And the reason for that is the acquisition of the Penguins, they came from Norway. It was kind of a political deal. I guess they had bought some of our aircraft, and in return, the Norwegians said, well, since we're buying your aircraft, you'll buy some of our missiles. So we bought this missile. It was an interesting weapon. I think it was better suited for more of an Arctic environment, colder temperatures, just based on some of the parameters of the weapon itself. But anyway, we had that weapon, and we mated it with our SH-60B. And I didn't get to shoot it because we had a limited number of them.
Okay.
So we did a lot of practice. We did a lot of simulation. We were very proficient at what would be the procedures to launch that weapon, but we didn't get to actually live fire that weapon.
Okay. You mentioned Hellfire at the end of your time. Was Hellfire fully mated to the Bravo by the time you left, or was it still in work?
Yes, it was. So the Hellfire was coming out, and it was a big deal for our community. It was a great leap forward in capability and having more weapons at our disposal. And again, I saw the beginning of that. When I mentioned one of 8 aircraft, early on there were 8 aircraft that were equipped to carry the Hellfire missile. And we were lucky in our squadron to have 2 of those aircraft, and then I cruised on one of them quite a bit. So anyway, it was a great increase in our capability, great increase in our anti-ship capability.
Okay. Just to kind of round out the helicopter, we mentioned sonobuoys, obviously. I'm trying to remember the torpedo that'd be carried on a starboard station, right? Because sonobuoys on the left, torpedo on the right, or am I misremembering that?
Well, as far as weapon stations goes, the sonobuoys would be carried internal to the body of the aircraft. We had basically 2, we called them stub wings, on either side, actually 3 weapon stations on the aircraft, 2 on the port side, 1 on the starboard side. And you could either put auxiliary fuel tank to extend our range, or you could carry torpedoes. So you see models with the aircraft maybe having 2 or 3 torpedoes on board. Not as realistic as what you may expect, simply because weight then becomes an issue. But there is capability of carrying more than 1 torpedo.
Okay. What kind of endurance for the helicopter? Let's say without that extra auxiliary fuel tank. Just
I would say
fuel.
our typical mission profile was about 3 hours. 3
Wow.
hours to 3.5.
Okay.
So we had pretty good endurance for that aircraft.
And then what about with the bag of gas? How much would that?
Yeah, for every aux tank that you carried, you're adding about an hour of endurance.
Wow. Okay, yeah. But I'm guessing also, and I'm trying to balance mission set versus just flight time in terms of a number on a clock. you're probably in forward flight for most of that. You might be, I'm guessing, in a hover or in a low hover when you're getting those sonobuoys off, or God forbid, punching a torpedo off. But the rest of it, you're in forward flight for most of it, so you're probably a little bit more efficient on gas. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. Typically, the only time we'd come into a hover is if we're doing the search and rescue mission, and we're trying to either drop in a swimmer or trying to pick someone up out of the water.
Okay.
But yeah, the rest of the time we'd be in forward flight. I guess the other times that we might be hovering would be in the vertical replenishment mission, where you're taking supplies, sling-loaded supplies from one ship to another. But even launching the sonobuoys, we would launch those from a launch envelope while the aircraft's in forward flight.
Okay. Wow. Interesting.
And they were parachute retarded.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
A little parachute pops out the back and it slows.
That's right.
Okay. Get it
Yep.
ready for water entry. Okay. Let's think what else. Well, I'm guessing you probably got your call sign in your first fleet squadron. Is that a story we can talk about here? Or?
Well, actually, the call sign story is kind of an interesting story, and that's probably left to a barside conversation with a
Okay.
nice cold libation.
Fair enough. Not what we have here today.
But let me just tell you something about the call sign. That's usually something when you make a mistake or do something boneheaded,
Yeah.
that you acquire those. But yeah, I'd be happy to relate that story to you sometime. Maybe that will be the next episode.
We can turn the mics off for that one. That's fine. Okay, cool. You said 3 years, a full 3 years at Atsuki.
That's right.
Okay. Any other great memories or good times in the 60? Obviously, your first fleet aircraft, first gray aircraft is always going to be a memorable one, and especially getting to do that overseas. I deployed a bunch overseas, but I was always at home. Home was America. Always will be. Always was for my time there. Being overseas and then deploying from overseas has to be a different fit as well.
Well, yeah, it was a great fleet experience, and I really enjoyed my time over there. And yeah, there are a lot of stories that I could relate, but as the name of this series is Safe on Deck, I'll just relate one that I think would be germane. So I looked through my logbook last night, and this happened on the 8th of December, 1998. We were doing a night mission, and as typical, when things go wrong, there was no place to divert to. So we were blue water operations, and we had no divert options. It was come back to the ship, or that's it. I was flying with a good buddy of mine, Lieutenant John Bushy. He was a junior hack at the time, so he was a brand new aircraft commander. It was his first time out. I had just gotten to the squadron several months prior, so I'm a junior 2P. And our petty officer in the back was Petty Officer Edmondson. He was a junior qualified crewman. The mission was SSC, which was the acronym standing for Sea Control. Basically, we're going to fly down the course line of the ship, looking for any contacts, reporting any contacts we saw back to our base, back to our ship. And we were about 150 miles downrange in front of the ship. Like I said, anytime things go wrong, it's always the worst possible time. This was a night mission. It was actually my second mission of the day. I'd flown during the day, an afternoon mission. Typically what we would do is we would launch and we'd fly a day mission, interface into night. And usually the turnover was a hot seat, keep the aircraft running, change out the crew, get fuel, and relaunch. So I'd flown the earlier mission, and it was a high sea state. It was wintertime, Sea of Japan, so a lot of waves, a lot of wind, and the ship was really rocking. The first mission I flew with the OIC of the DET, officer in charge. And he came aboard. He did the first approach and 2 landings. He had a tough time with his landings. I did the next landing. Hey, it was a tough deck. The deck's really pitching and rolling. We come on board. We secured the aircraft with the RAST system, so we got the beams keeping the aircraft on the deck. We chalk and chain the aircraft. Rotors are spinning. We get fuel. New crewman comes on board. That's Lieutenant John Bushy. And we get ready to launch. We launch right at sunset. We fly 150 miles downrange. By this time, it's pitch black. and it is a dark night. We've got some high overcast, and it is dark. We're flying at 120. We're flying at 120 knots, about 100 feet above the ground, above the water. And as we're flying along, I just had this sensation, and I couldn't really figure out what it was. But I was sitting in the right seat. I was the 2P. John Bushy was flying, and I had this sensation that something was wrong. And I just happened to look up, and I catch the needle on the radar altimeter, the rad alt, is descending, and it's descending rapidly. The scale on the rad alt was usually like 100-foot increments, but when you get below 100 feet, then it was broke out into like 20-foot increments or something to that effect. So once it would hit 100 feet, it would start to rapidly descend if you're descending, just due to the scale. Anyway, I look up and I see that needle, and that needle is accelerating towards 0. In other words, we're coming down. And I said, altitude. And anyway, John catches that and stabilizes the aircraft. Out of the corner of my eye, we've got a flashing master caution. This is what had precipitated the descent. Look over at the main instrument, or the main caution annunciator panel. We had like 100 plus warnings and caution lights. And there's the AFCS light is blinking at us. So AFCS fail. Reach up, push out the master caution light. And the procedure is pretty simple. You just reach down and you reset the system. The system's supposed to reset, and you should be able to fly again. So the warning light had come on. The caution light had come on. We're descending. I called out altitude. I'm watching John fly on the instruments. We get back up to our altitude, and I'm starting to deal with the emergency, trying to reset the automatic flight control system. And I had the same sinking feeling again. And I looked down at the rad alt, and again, we are descending towards the water. Now, something to point out just system-wise about the aircraft, and that is the automatic flight control system did 19 functions for the aircraft, and all of which are very important. A couple things that it did was it was directly connected to the rad alt hold, which would maintain your altitude, very important for flying at night over the sea. And it also implemented feel into the controls. This is a heavy aircraft, 12.5 tons, that are all hydraulically boosted on the flight controls. So if you don't have artificial feel, because of the nature of the hydraulic boosting, you don't have those inputs back to the pilot that when you push the stick and you have that resistance, gives you kind of the feel on how the controls are operating. Anyway, long story short, when the AFCS system failed, it felt like the controls were just loose and free. I mean, they would just, like if you let go of them, they would just flop over to the side. And of course, the aircraft's going to go along with that control input. So, the aircraft's descending again towards the water. I would say we came within 20 to 40 feet of a CFIT type mishap, controlled flight into terrain. So I called out to John. I said, altitude. And again, I'm backing him up on the instruments. We're trying to fly the aircraft, make sure we don't run into the water. And at that juncture, I said, John, we need to climb. We just need to climb up to 2,000 feet so we can handle this emergency. And that's what we did. We stopped the emergency right there. He's flying the aircraft. I back him up on the instruments. We didn't deal with the emergency. We just started climbing up to 2,000 feet. We get up to 2,000 feet. We level off. Again, we're on instruments. It's a dark night out. And try to go through the procedure, reset the AFCS system. I break out the checklist, make sure we didn't miss any steps. The system would not reset. At that point, hey, we got to get back to the ship. So we turn around. We declare an emergency with the ship. The ship goes to flank speed to close distance with us. We're still 100 plus miles out from the ship, and we're flying back, and we start to talk about our situation and how we're going to bring this plane aboard. We knew we were in for a real situation. Now, in the back of my mind, kind of an interesting thing is that one of my really good friends from flight school and API was a Marine pilot, and he had been lost in a CFIT mishap. This was 18 September of 98, so just a few months prior to this. He'd been lost off the coast of California. He flew with HMLA 267, flying the UH-1. They were out doing training at night. They had taken off from the Rushmore. Unfortunately, a very insidious slight descent, and it was a CFIT mishap, flew into the water, and they were all lost. I remember thinking, in my mind, I was like, man, so this is what it feels like. Anyway, we start working on trying to get the ship, the aircraft back to the ship. And we finally get in proximity to the ship. We declare an emergency. We start our approach. John Bushy had given me the controls. We had been switching back and forth just because it was very taxing to try to fly the aircraft in these conditions, with the controls being as they were. And of course, the aircraft at this point is very unstable. It's moving around about all the axis of the aircraft. I fly the first approach, not very good. I got us close to the deck, and it wasn't, we didn't have a safe condition to land, so we ended up waving off the approach. We came back for the second approach. We'd gotten over the deck, and we had requested a clear deck landing, so we had the RAST system moved out of the way because we didn't want to have that in the way of us as we were coming down to land. And again, I knew the deck was a difficult one based on the sea state and the way the ship was moving. We get over the flight deck. The ship is pitching and rolling heavily, and our aircraft is very unstable. And of course, it's dark, very reduced visual cues. And I remember, it looked good, and so I put a full collective input in. John's flying the aircraft. This is not standard protocol, and it looked good, and boom, I put in a collective input, and we slammed down on the deck. But we were there. We had made it. It was nothing pretty, and I give credit to all hands on board that aircraft, John Bushy, Petty Officer Edmondson, and even maybe a little credit to myself. But it was by far one of the closest calls that I've had in aviation to date. And anyway, I'm glad we were able to bring back the aircraft. There were no other options as far as landing. It was either land on the ship or we were going to go swimming that night. And anyway, I also remember thinking about my friends. So it was a very sobering experience.
Of course. In the analysis afterwards, was there any investigation done? Was there any reason why that AFCS system failed?
Okay, yeah, good question. So you never quite know the full story until you get on the ground and the maintainers get in there. What we found out later was that the front of the aircraft, we call it the hood, opens up to access some of the avionics equipment that's held in the aircraft. And the aircraft had a number of flight computers on board, and there was a little junction box where a number of inputs would plug into it and, again, serve to control various systems on board the aircraft. So this little AFCS, automatic flight control system junction box, had caught on fire. And so it had burned up, And that's why I was unable to reset the system as we're flying along. There was nothing that we could have done as a crew to fix that problem on board the aircraft that night. So luckily, we were able to bring the aircraft back in that condition.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was literally nothing you could have done. Wow.
No, yeah.
Wow.
It's just pure airmanship at that point. And that's one thing about flying. It does require a lot of confidence to land a ship or land an aircraft on a ship, especially at night. But, the other thing beyond confidence is just that willingness to get down to business and just do what needs to be done. And, in this case, we had no options. It was land on the ship or you're going in the water, period. So just kind of a real feeling, a sense of just rolling up the sleeves, getting down to work, and we're going to land this plane.
Of all the flying you'd done prior to that point, Phil, what do you think prepared you the best for that? Because like you said, it's a team exercise. And I want to be clear, were you split controls? Was he pedals and stick and you were managing the collective? Was that, that's a very non-standard thing. That's the reason I bring it up. Was that?
No, we didn't split controls per se.
Okay.
But it was, we did trade off from station to station. So he was flying for a period of time. I was flying for a period of time. Because, again, it was very mentally taxing.
Okay.
We're in an unstable aircraft with a very different feel on the flight controls as we're in hard IFR conditions. So he would fly for a few minutes, give me the controls. I would fly for a few minutes. Now, keep in mind, when we weren't flying, the non-flying pilot was backing up the flying pilot on instruments and giving him cues like, hey, watch your altitude, hey, watch, course, all those type of things. So, one thing I would say is good CRM, crew resource management that night, and how we're able to work together. But as far as the question of preparation, nothing had prepared me for that. Now, that being said, everything had prepared me for that. And what I mean by that is all the work that we do, flying instruments, that was helpful because it was instrument conditions. All of the emphasis in emergency procedures and managing an emergency, that had prepared us. All of the emphasis in crew resource management, that had prepared us, because at the end of the day, we had all that going on. We were in instrument conditions, we worked together as a crew, and we handled the emergency to the best of our abilities. Given the cards that we were given, there's nothing we could have done for that aircraft, but we made some good decisions. Number one, and this is what saved our life, is climbing to altitude to deal with the emergency. That almost got us twice. So we made good decisions. We climbed altitude. We immediately headed back towards the ship. We declared an emergency. The ship was very helpful. They came at us full speed. They gave us the best deck that they could, but again, with the winds and waves, it was still a very rough flight deck. The LSO was helpful. They were looking out for us on our approach. The DET OIC was in CIC, the Combat Information Center, with an ATOPS helping us to troubleshoot. So it was all hands effort to bring this aircraft back. And, a little bit of luck involved, a lot of skill, and we were able to bring the plane back.
Absolutely. Well, I think you're selling yourself just a little bit short because you're right. That CRM side of it, it's a team. It's not you and I, you versus I, or you versus me. I don't know. It's you and I versus the problem.
That's right.
Because the consequences are the same for all three of you on board that aircraft. So.
Yep, that's right. So it was everybody on board the aircraft, everybody on board the ship.
Yep. That's really, great point. It's the whole team together. That's really awesome. Okay, so looking at the resume here, 920 hours in the Bravo, and I'm guessing that's FRS, the training squadron, and then obviously your operational time in the helicopter as well.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
It was a lot. I wish that I had been able to break 1,000 hours. Some guys were able to do it. The last little bit of my time there at the squadron, I was given the position of operations officer. So at that point, it was a lot of office work trying to track down and maintain 7 detachments around the world. And I didn't have as much time to fly my last few months in the squadron. But I want to say just over 920 hours, like 926.
That's awesome.
Like that.
And that ended in, July of 98 to July of 01. And
That's
then after that, on to HT-18 to instruct now in the in the mighty Sea Ranger in the TH-57.
That's right. So after my fleet tour there, I wanted to stay in the cockpit. I wanted to keep flying. And I was very lucky to be assigned to HT-18, Vigilant Eagles, come back and do some flight instruction.
The reason I mentioned the dates, I'm not just pulling those out of the hat for no reason at all.
Yeah.
It was a pretty significant event in world events. I would say happened only a couple months later. Do you remember where you were that day?
I do. So I got back. Well, let me just back up for a moment.
Of course.
I got done with my fleet tour. That was July of 98. And again, due to the operational tempo, the op tempo of the fleet tour, I had well over 100 days of leave on the books. And I told the detailer, I said, hey, I really want to take some time en route. So I had taken 45 days, spent some time in Europe. Instead of just flying back from Japan over the Pacific once again, I went the other way and landed in Paris, France. Had a great time in Europe there for 45 days. But I got back here to Pensacola, Florida, checked into HT-18. And one of the things that you have to do when you come back as an instructor is you have to go back through the helicopter instructor training unit. So I was going through all that. And I had to renew my swim qualifications. This is all the survival swim stuff. This is training like if the aircraft were to ditch in the sea, how you'd get out of the aircraft and everything like that. And so I was down here at NAS Pensacola. We just showed up for swim qual, and you start out training. The instructor greets you. You're in a classroom. There was a couple training films to watch, and then we're going to go down, change over, and get into the pool and do our survival stuff. Well, the instructor starts the film, turns out the lights. We're watching this video. 5 minutes later, the instructor comes rushing back in, comes right up to the head of the classroom, turns on the lights, turns off the film, and says, everybody, stand up and follow me. We had no idea what was going on. He led us back into the instructor lounge. There's a couple big screen televisions in there. Everybody's gathered around watching television, and we were just in time to see live footage of the second airliner hitting the World Trade Towers there in New York City, 9/11.
Yeah.
Anyway, obviously training was canceled for the day, and you kind of wonder what to do at that point. But my first thought was, I got to get back to my command. So I immediately saddled up, got in the car, and started driving towards HT-18. I got out to the main gate there at Whiting Field and was promptly told, nobody's coming on base. Essential crew only, and apparently I wasn't that. So headed home to monitor the situation and try to make heads or tails of what was happening that day.
So you served, the reason I mention this, you served in the military pre-9/11 and then post-9/11.
That's right.
I, second grade, third grade, I was in grade school when 9/11 happened. So it influenced the course of my life, but not how it influenced the course of your life, because you got to see the DoD and the Navy pre and post 9/11. A lot of people have spoken about changes and maybe that philosophy, that mindset. We were ready for the Russian bear, right? We were in that Cold War mentality. But then things changed when we had a very actual adversary. I'm not saying that it wasn't an actual adversary, but things changed.
Yeah.
Can you speak to any of that? Was that a mindset that you felt that changed? I know obviously you were here at Pensacola for that, but was that something that you observed as well, or was it really not? We're still getting naval aviators ready to go out to the fleet either way.
Well, that's a very complex subject in and of itself, and a lot of things could be said, and not a lot of analysis could be done on the events of 9/11, but just my own personal take on it. First and foremost, it was a watershed event. 9/11 changed everything. from a historical perspective, I mean, that was the second time that America had been attacked. We were at peace in both occasions. The first one, Pearl Harbor, 7 December 1941, you had the efforts of an entire nation and their military coming against us. And they attacked us on the periphery. On 9/11, you had just a small group of guys, what were there, 22, 23 attackers, using quite innovative methods, strategy, tactics to attack us right at the heart of our nation. But very similar results in that in both cases, grave damage was done to our nation, large loss of life, a lot of people injured. But it really just started a new era. From the military perspective, things didn't change as much as you would suspect. I mean, the military's always been in the business of defending this nation. That continued. But I would think that the things that did change were, number one, the sense of urgency. We knew that there were elements out there that were willing to sacrifice everything to attack this nation. So I think it increased our sense of urgency in terms of defending the nation, and it also pointed us in a new direction in terms of the threat vector. Prior to 9/11, the big threat had always been another nation state, another military. That's what the focus was, the Cold War, going head-to-head against the Russians. After 9/11, you have non-state actors, small groups of people, organizations, Al-Qaeda, etc. So I think it really changed our focus and our direction, and that came about as a different threat vector to this nation. But a very serious event, and again, it changed the trajectory of the global community.
Absolutely. So that's kind of starting we're talking about bookending. That was the beginning of your time at HT-18. What was it like, again, on the other side of the curtain? Now you're the guy giving the instructions to the guy necessarily receiving the instruction. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah. I would consider that HT-18 was one of my favorite chores, being an instructor pilot there, because in my mind, it combined two of the great things. The first was flying. So every day getting to go out and fly an aircraft is unparalleled situation. But also, too, it had the element of teaching. And so when you combine both of those, teaching and flying, it just really made for a great tour and a great job. I'm very fortunate that, again, I was selected to be an instructor. Very fortunate that I was able to fly there with HT-18. Really enjoyed my time. And I kind of saw my role as trying to provide those young student naval aviators with all of my experience so that they could survive situations like what I had encountered. The night there trying to come back aboard with the AFCS failure. So I did my best to impart the experience that I had accrued and my knowledge onto those young naval aviators.
That's really great. Any good memorable cross country? I know the 57 can't go quite that far. But.
Well, I'll tell you, I love flying, and I try to fly as much as possible. One thing we found was a lot of guys, at this stage of their careers, they just come off sea tours. They were married. They didn't want to fly on the weekends. But I was still at the time a single guy, and out of the love of flying and the love of going places, traveling, I tried to fly as many cross countries as I could. So I was always on what we call the cross country board. Hey, if you want to go somewhere, Lieutenant Commander Webb, he's the guy that you want to fly with. And actually, I was still a lieutenant at that time. Lieutenant Webb, he's the guy you want to fly with. So anyway, I had a number of students who would come up to me and say, hey, let's go fly. Let's do cross country. And we had some great cross countries. A couple that stick out in my mind. The first was flying aircraft 121. I still remember the side number on that. Had a student come up, wanted to go up to D.C., so we flew up to Andrews Air Force Base. And pretty high-level student. He goes, "Hey, sir, let's when we leave here, let's do the VFR route over the Potomac through downtown." I'm like, "Oh, you're killing me here. We're never going to get that approved." But anyway, he had done quite a bit of homework. Like I said, he was a great student. And we were able to file for that, and we were able to get authorization to fly the VFR route over the Potomac.
Wow.
And again, this is in the wake of 9/11, so even the more remarkable and credible. That was one of my favorite flights, just flying right down the Potomac, looking off to the left. Hey, there's Reagan National. Looking over to the right, seeing, the Capitol building, the White House, the Washington Monument. Getting to fly over some of the bridges there. I mean, it was a great moment.
You didn't land at any point in that flight, did you?
Did not.
Only reason I ask that, when I was at HM-15 in Norfolk, actually, no, I think I was at HM-12 as a student. I had the opportunity to fly with the U.S. Park Police, with Prince George County on their 520, MD-520, and I actually got a chance to fly with D.C. Metro and their A-Star, and they are right there by the stadium for the Washington Nationals. Their little helipad is within throwing distance of that stadium, and they had I thought it was an HT-18 sticker in their spot there, and they mentioned that they had a TH-57 come in and land, and they'd have arranged prior permission, but same thing, flying the river, and so I didn't know if it was that small of a world, but I know other folks have done it. Of course, that's something now I don't think would ever fly, so to speak. That's so cool that you got to experience that airspace from that altitude and that perspective.
Oh, it was a great experience. A lot of great flying going on. And the irony is as we were coming back, of course, D.C. to Pensacola, it's a long day in the saddle.
Yeah.
And you throw in that little excursion, and then, of course, our last leg, IFR conditions down here. And we start getting close, and we're on IFR flight plan. And we check in, and we requested an approach and landing there at Whiting Field, and they said, "Roger, 121, you'll be number 10 for your approach." So anyway, all that to say, we got vectored around quite a bit, and we're finally able to come in and land about the time we're starting to get the low fuel lights coming on, and so things were starting to get a little bit critical, but hey, we made it on the ground. I go in to log all the flights and count up the flight time, and I bested our SOP maximum flight time for the day, which was 8 hours. So I went slightly over that, I think 8.5 hours, something like that. Hey, I logged it as honestly, and you have to understand that anytime you take a bird away for cross country, well, they expect you to be back on time because they need that plane to fly the following Monday. So anyway, I did my best to get the plane back. I logged my flight time honestly, and I busted the maximum flight time. I got grounded after that for a week. So
really?
Yes.
Oh my.
Which was ironic, but anyway. So this had happened. There was a couple other aircraft in our flight. Another good friend of mine, fellow instructor. We got grounded together. I think there were 3 of us that had gotten grounded. And the irony is that, oh my, you're going to give us some time off now, because we were flying daily, very heavy flight schedules. So it was nice to have a little bit of time off. But we got some great patches made up. We had this little blue background with a little penguin put on it. And we became the Penguin Club. Why? Because we're not flying. But anyway, so that was kind of ironic.
That's awesome. Interesting. Yeah, I was going to say I've not been a skipper. I've not even been really higher than a lieutenant. That's all I am now. But each head shed, I think, kind of prioritizes stuff differently. And the reason I mention that is, again, I'm not the boss. I've never been the boss. But if I had an aviator come to me and say, "Hey, boss, here was the plan. I overflew it by X amount of minutes or hours or whatever."
Right.
That was the safest option. I didn't plan to break the rules.
Yeah.
And here's what we did next to get back your aircraft back. I don't know. I guess you have to have that trust, though. By the same token, I have to trust that person bringing that plan to me, or maybe not even that plan, that story to me. It's not a story, it's the truth. So there's that side of it, too. And I certainly wasn't there, so I don't know. But it's interesting.
Well, and I think, again, the CO's decision, the skipper's decision is always theirs alone.
Absolutely.
But I think because there was more than just myself, I think the CO felt impelled to make examples. And, we took it with a grain of salt. We thought it was funny. They needed us to fly. So after a short time off, like a week out of the saddle, we were right back in there.
Sure. Looking at the resume again here, you mentioned Shipboard Operations was... were you still bringing folks out to the Pensacola Bay? Was Baylander still in operation when you were an instructor pilot?
That's a good question, and I did not do that when I came back as an instructor.
Okay.
You had several different avenues that you could go in terms of instructing, and I elected to go teach FAMs, what they called FAMs at the time. So I would take a new student who had never flown the aircraft. I'd do FAM 0, which is taking them out, walking around the plane, teach them how to pre-flight. And then I would take them from their first flight all the way up to their safe for solo check ride. And that's one thing that I really enjoyed was imparting those stick and rudder skills to the young students and, teaching them how to fly helicopters. So that's what I specialized in, and that's what I did for the bulk of my time here.
Okay, that makes sense. And you see the bulk of your time, 1,341 hours in the Bravo. And I know that a little bit of that is your flight training going through, but that is a lot of flight time.
Yes, it is.
In 3 years. That's really impressive.
Yeah.
Were you, I'm guessing, probably one of the high flyers of your peer group, like for the reasons you mentioned earlier?
So we always tracked that flight time, and it was kind of interesting to see, they'd keep that right there in the ODO office. That's the officer duty office on a clipboard, and you could always see who the top flyers were. And hey, I was there to fly, and I flew a lot. I did my best. A couple months. We have NATOPS limits, and I think one of the hard ones is 100 hours in 30 days. Hit that limit a couple times. I came back from a long cross country out to New Mexico one time, and I just got back to the squadron. I was walking through the hallways, and the ops officer came out to me and said, "Hey, you, go home." I'm like, "It's the 26th." And he goes, "You've already hit your limits for the month. You got to go home." So anyway, it was good to have a couple days off there because, again, these numbers are important, and they're designed to keep guys safe. And hence, that's why I got grounded, and that's why I got sent home that time.
Absolutely. Speaking of staying safe, Speaking of staying safe in the TH-57, I think I've read several different places. The Bell 206 is, I think, by the hours, by the mishap, it is the safest aircraft in the world. I don't know if I'm misquoting or I'm definitely giving Bell a lot of credit there.
You're exactly right.
Yeah, it's an incredibly, I don't want to say simple. It's complex in many ways, but as a helicopter goes, very simple machine. Any good EPs or any good stories in the Mighty Sea Ranger when you were an instructor pilot?
Well, so you're exactly right about that. Just looking at the number of flight hours that platform has flown, it's probably one of the safest aircraft of all time. And I was very proud of the fact that all of the training commands had mishap-free flight training records going back years and years, well over 1 million flight hours, etc. Unfortunately, we did have some mishaps after I departed my instructor tour there, and we actually lost a student in a mishap.
Wow.
So very unfortunate that happened. Hey, listen, aviation is hazardous. You can never get past that. We try our hardest to mitigate against any kind of hazards and risk, but it still is a hazardous occupation at the end of the day. But so flying the TH-57 day in, day out, a lot of fun. I remember one time we had a tail rotor chip light. That's a land as soon as possible emergency. We ended up in a field. It was kind of interesting. The farmer was out in the field as well. He's driving his tractor, and he's baling some hay. We land, we shut down. And I would have thought that the farmer would come right over, and check on us and everything. So we get everything shut down and secured. Finally, I ended up walking over to the farmer, and he kind of didn't pay me any attention. He kept going. So finally, I kind of waved him down. I said, "Hey, we just had to do a precautionary landing in your field. Sorry about that. Do you mind giving us a hand here?" And he said something to the effect that, "Oh yeah, this happens once a week." So anyway, wasn't the first to land in his field, and I'm surely not the last, but
just fuzz, I'm guessing. It probably wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't anything critical.
Truck of shame. They put the
put the
helicopter.
Bring the truck out, truck the aircraft home, check it out with maintenance. But again, that's one of the Navy ways of training pilots is to know the aircraft and to know the procedures and to fly in a safe manner at all times.
Yep. Turn that flying EP into a ground EP. Once it's on deck, if that gearbox tears itself apart, we're alive to talk about it. And
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Gotcha. Cool. From there, from HT8, unless you have any other memorable events or memorable moments there, again, 1,300 hours is a lot of flight time in the TH-57.
Yes, it was.
But from there to the USS San Antonio, LPD-17.
Well, I did have an interesting experience.
Oh, okay.
And this is actually kind of funny.
I'll pump the brakes. Go back.
So we would oftentimes, we would have a couple students in the brief. We were doing a very extensive brief. We'd go out, check out the aircraft, go out, pre-flight the aircraft. You'd fly with the first student, then you'd come back, get fuel. This was a hot refuel, so we keep everything running. Get fuel, and then we'd come over and park in an area. We call it the hot seat area. And this is when the other student would meet you out there at the aircraft. The one student will get out of the aircraft, the other student will come and get in the aircraft. And usually, the students, you could brief them and say, hey, you hold the controls, guard the aircraft. I'm going to run into the restroom. I'll be right back. Keep in mind, the aircraft's still turning, the engine's on, the rotor system's moving. Anyway, I had done this with one of my students. I go in to take a quick break in the crew change shack and go to the restroom. And I get in the restroom, and I close the door, do my business, get ready to come back out, and I reach down and I grab the handle of the door, and the handle comes off in my hand. Well, I fiddle with it, I try to put the handle back on, everything I tried. Finally, at the end of this, I'm kicking this door as hard as I possibly can. It's one of these thick, solid doors, and it is locked up, and I am stuck in the restroom. I tried to use my cell phone. There was no reception in there because of the, construction of the restroom. So I'm stuck in there. Finally, another student comes in, and I'm banging on the door, and I'm able to yell through the door, hey, get the duty office and let them know I'm stuck in here, and my aircraft is out there turning. Anyway, they're able to relay the message up. They were able to send another pilot down. They basically took my aircraft, taxied it over to the line, shut down. That student's done for the day. I'm stuck in there for well over an hour. They had to bring in like base maintenance and basically chop through the door handle from the outside to finally get that door open. Anyway, so it was kind of an interesting experience that happened to me there.
Good Lord.
Now, one thing that's kind of funny is some enterprising young sailors, and you have to admire the sense of humor of your typical sailor. Our chief at the time, when they were able to bust through the door, he took and collected all of those pieces of the door handle, the lock mechanism and everything else, and he kept all those. Well, they went out and got a wooden plaque, and then they superglued all these pieces of the door onto this wooden plaque, and they made up a little plaque, and it's got the date on there with my name, and it's got head commander. And so I still have this in my collection. It's quite a memorable thing.
And I'm sure one day it'll end up at the museum here in Pensacola.
Possibly.
Fine moments incredible moments in naval aviation history. Yeah.
Hey, everybody thinks naval aviation is, what they see in the movie like Top Gun. Everybody's out playing volleyball in the sunshine, all slicked up with suntan lotion. But there are many mundane and very inauspicious moments in naval aviation.
There's a song about me. It's Amore. Have I told you that? One of the guys wrote down all the verses. I'll have to tell you that later. All the exciting things I did. So
very funny. Okay,
so in May of 2004, that's when you went to the USS San Antonio LPD-17. Was that in the shipyard here in Gulfport, or am I thinking of something different?
Okay, so when you look at the career progression for a naval aviator, typically you go through flight training, you'll do a fleet tour. Sometimes you'll come back, you'll do an instructing tour, or you can go off, be an admiral's aide, etc. But one of the things that they want you to do to be a well-rounded naval officer is to do a disassociated sea tour, and that's where you actually go out on the ship, and typically you'll do something aviation related. In this case, I was sent to the USS San Antonio to be part of the Air Department, and that's all of the sailors that are on board the ship there to support aviation operations to the flight deck of the USS San Antonio. So at the time, the ship was being constructed in New Orleans, and I thought it would be a good tour. Much to my chagrin, it did not end up being a good tour because a ship in a shipyard is not a good place to be. But it was great from a personal aspect. I was able to start my master's degree, able to live in the great city of New Orleans while the ship was being built. I got to enjoy the Hurricane Katrina experience. I saw New Orleans before the storm, New Orleans after the storm. Quite an appreciable difference, but anyway, it was a dissociated sea tour, and that inspired my next tour, which was my best.
Okay.
So I'd call that my least favorite tour in the Navy.
Totally fair, but I'm going to ask about one part of it since you just kind of talked through Katrina. What was Hurricane Katrina like?
So Hurricane Katrina was an interesting experience. By the time the hurricane had hit, they had moved the ship from Avondale Shipyard right there in New Orleans. They had moved it over to Pascagoula, Mississippi, to try to complete the ship at that shipyard, Northrop Grumman. And it was kind of interesting because, here it is, August of 2005, right in the middle of hurricane season. The skipper of the ship was actually up in D.C., and we're on the ship, and we're watching this hurricane track towards, the Gulf Coast. We don't know exactly where it's going to go. And the skipper was like, "Hey, XO, you're on board the ship. We're just going to leave the crew on board the ship, and I'll see you guys when I come back." Well, finally an admiral said, "Hey, Captain, are you going to be on board your ship?" So the captain came back in a flurry, and kind of interesting there. But anyway, we did the best we could to prepare ourselves for the hurricane. Now, the interesting thing about it was the ship was kind of one of those gray areas. We'd actually signed for the ship, but the ship is still under construction, not exactly seaworthy. So the Navy owned it, but it's still being worked on by the shipyard, and we're not seaworthy. If we had been able to get underway and go out in the Gulf, we could avoid the storm altogether. But as it was, we weren't able to do so, so we were constrained to stay right there pierside when the storm came ashore. I guess it's a good thing that the crew was on board the ship when the hurricane hit. We had quite a storm surge, I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 to 25 feet, depending on where you measure that. So the interesting thing about that experience was we were on board the ship. The storm surge is happening. The winds are kicking up. You can hear the wind howling around the ship through the hull. And with the storm surge, the ship started to float up. And we had these big mooring lines. We had doubled up all the mooring lines. These rings were about 4.5 inches in diameter. They were huge lines. And because the ship was floating up away from the dock, these things were being tightened. And as they were being stretched, these things were about, I would say, the diameter of a silver dollar, something like that. So pretty appreciable stretching of these cables that were keeping us to the pier. Anyway, what we were able to do, the engineering department, great job there. They were able to flood. It was an amphibious ship. They were able to flood the hull and lower the ship down into the water so that we kept our lines from snapping. So I think saved the ship. So good job on the engineering department. It was neat to watch the forces of nature. It was a very interesting experience. There were a couple DDG destroyers in front of us, and those ships were pushed over at about a 45-degree angle and just driven into the pier and heavily damaged during the storm.
Obviously not manned. There was not crews aboard those ships. They were just essentially left.
That's right. That's right.
Holy moly.
They still belonged to the company, Northrop Grumman at the time. They were under construction.
Yeah.
So they doubled up the lines and left. and they were heavily damaged, flooding in the engine compartments and everything else. So, I mean, it was a damaging storm, to be sure. One thing that was kind of interesting was our chief engineer, he had come back to the ship late and had parked a brand new a large Ford pickup truck right there in the parking lot, right there next to the ship. We watched this whole thing unfold as the waters rose above the dock level and started coming across. And the first thing that happened was this Ford pickup truck started to weather vane into the wave line. That was kind of neat. And I guess they have some sensors on board the truck so that whenever that thing became semi-submerged, the lights started flashing, the alarm came on, and then the windows came down, because that's what it does so people don't get trapped in it if someone drives off the road into a lake or a water body. Anyway, so then the windows came down. Next thing you know, this truck's completely submerged in the water. So that was kind of our fun to poke fun of the chief engineer and what had happened to his truck.
Now, I remember you, because you and I had gone flying past the base, and I remember you mentioned that there was an area there where I think some of the helicopter effort passed through. Is that correct? Where they were basically, flying from points east into New Orleans to do
That's
rescues
right.
and move, supplies.
So what do you do with a bunch of aviators on board a ship after the storm has passed? Well, there was a helicopter pad right across the bay there from us. We didn't want to let aircraft land on our flight deck because we weren't certified at the time. We could have done it, but the CO was not wanting to do that. So what we did was we set up a landing zone, and we were able to support a lot of relief supplies coming into the local area, both for Pascagoula and New Orleans.
And that's a great point. Yeah, Pascagoula itself was heavily damaged, not just the New Orleans area. There was a lot of other places along the Gulf Coast that felt the brunt of that storm.
That's right. Heavily damaged in that area. And so there was really a great need to bring in like water and food and those type of things for people that were suffering the after effects of the storm.
Of course. Okay, from the worst to the best, as we keep working down the resume, your next tour, combat deployment to Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. So could you tell me a little bit about what that experience was like?
Oh, yeah.
How did you even get teed up for that? How was that something that when you spoke with the detailer, it was a hot fill? Was it something that you knew about that you were able to kind of work your way into? There's a little bit of a science to that, but...
Okay, so to explain how I got there, after I left the USS San Antonio, again, that was what I considered to be my worst tour in the Navy, just because of the dynamics of what that tour entailed. I decided after that I wanted to do something a little bit different, so I kind of jumped off the career track. And I'd enjoyed my time overseas, enjoyed my time in Japan, and I wanted to do something similar to that. So I started looking into the Naval Attaché program. And I've been working with the detailers and the attaché detailer, and I'd printed off the list of all the upcoming tours. And of all of the locations to go to, Malta was on the list. And my interest in history, my love of history, I'm like, I need to go to Malta. That's one of the most historic places in the world. So I went through the process, submitted my package. I got selected, got called up to D.C. for an interview. Very fortunate to have been selected to serve as Naval Attaché of Malta, and I did that for just over 3 years. It was hands down the best tour of my life. Now, during this period of time, I had seen a lot of my flight students that I'd kept in touch with. They had gone off and served in either Iraq or Afghanistan, and I felt a little bit guilty that here I was living the cushy life in the middle of the Mediterranean on the diplomatic circuit, living in a great flat overlooking the Mediterranean. At nighttime, I can see the lights of Sicily 60 nautical miles away, looking down, seeing the beautiful sparkling waters of the Mediterranean. So I felt guilty. And so I volunteered. Volunteered to go to Afghanistan. It just so happened whenever I was going through the orders process, they had this position open flying drones with PMA 266. That's flying the MQ-8 Bravo, which is actually a helicopter, full-size helicopter that is unmanned and they used it for a number of missions, but primarily overwatch of our troops and also looking for the bad guys.
Okay. MQ-8, I was going to say the Bell 407 helicopter. Does that sound about right? Or is it the Schweitzer helicopter?
Yeah, at that time, the
300.
Bravo was the Schweitzer.
Okay, gotcha.
But they're actually changing that. The Charlie model will be a full-size Bell Jet Ranger, basically.
Okay, very cool. And I know obviously there's not a whole lot you can talk about that whole mission set, but...
Yeah. It was a great experience. Besides volunteering and wanting to go over there to serve the nation, I also wanted to see for myself what we were doing. So, I felt duty bound to volunteer and go over and do that. And anyway, it was great training provided by the Army. It was great to meet people that were also serving. A couple things I would like to point out. When we're going through the training, getting ready to go, there was a whole bunch of us. And the Navy, keep in mind, this is a ground conflict. So the Army and the Marine Corps were bearing the brunt of combat operations. And those guys had served and served and served. So the Navy is trying to help out the cause, but doing so only in kind of a minor capacity. And there was a big haul of us, I would say probably several hundred of us, and we're going through some end processing. And I remember one moment as they're getting ready to go over the schedule, and they wanted to, tell us what the training would entail. They said, okay, hey, show of hands, how many of you guys, this is your first combat deployment? And about half the room raised their hands. I said, okay, how about second deployment? There's about 20% of us raised our hands. Third deployment, there was some guys raised their hands. Fourth deployment, fifth deployment, sixth deployment, 7 deployments. This kid raised his hand. He was going to war for the 7th time. Anyway, it's amazing to see that 9/11 had happened. A lot had transpired since then. Here we are, well over a decade into this global conflict, the war on terror, and some young service members had basically spent their entire careers at war. Anyway, I say that to highlight the endeavor that is serving the nation, our national defense, and kind of the sacrifice and price that's paid by some.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So coming back from, and I guess I should point out the resume I have in front of me is the flying resume. I knew that the air attaché job was on there, and I did not. I skipped right past it. So I want to make sure I don't skip anywhere beyond that after Afghanistan. Was that when you were back at NATSE, back here at Pensacola, or was there anything in between the two?
Okay, so I went from Malta to Afghanistan.
Okay.
Obviously, there was some training, did some of that at Pax River. That was a great experience, getting to see where they do a lot of the test piloting and whatnot. Very good, thorough training. It was interesting flying drones, as they're commonly known in the civilian parlance. It's a vastly different kind of flying than being in the aircraft. Here's an example. When you're flying an aircraft, you're sitting in the plane and you are the center of the universe. So if ATC, air traffic control, says, hey, turn left, well, it's very intuitive. You're turning left. Now, if you have a drone out there and you're sitting in a controlling station and that drone is 60 nautical miles away, and ATC, because you're still talking through the radios on board the aircraft, tells you to turn left, okay, you have to put yourself in the aircraft, so to speak, and turn left. Especially we were close to some international borders, and if you flew the wrong direction, you could fly into another nation's airspace and create an international incident. So it's a whole different kind of flying. I would have never suspected that I'd ever be flying drones. I'm glad to have had the experience, and I'm glad to have served in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. That's awesome. So after that, back here to Pensacola, was that the next stop on the tour?
Yeah, so after I had finished my tour there in Afghanistan, I'd been thinking for a long period of time what I wanted to do. for my final tour, and I knew that I wanted to stay in Pensacola after the Navy, so I kind of engineered that my final tour would be here in Pensacola. I came back to be an instructor at Naval Aviation Schools Command, and I was in charge of the IMT, International Military Training Office, and that was right here at NAS Pensacola.
That's right. Okay, cool. So I wanted to make sure I covered that for sure. But yeah, so obviously Department of Aviation instructor. So yes, the International Military Training Office, and then that's the flight training for the allied nations that come to fly with us. So just to be clear, obviously at Pensacola we train naval aviators, but we also train backseaters as well.
Our allies,
and then our allies that in a lot of cases have purchased weapon systems or aircraft from the United States, or we have an interest in training, and
Hey, and let me just put a note in here too. That is a really great program that the U.S. Navy engages in, and the whole idea is if we can train our allies can defend their own little portion of the globe. And that's one less thing that the American servicemen have to do. So it's a great program. We often charge our allied nations quite a fee to train them, and those monies help provide funding for our flight training. So I forget what the exact number is, but for every foreign military pilot that we train, we can pay for 2 or 3 of our guys to train as well.
That's incredible. What nations do you remember that you had when you were at the IMT office that were partners with the U.S.?
Yeah, so we had a number of nations would send their students to train with us. We had some of the European nations, for example, Norway, France. We also had some Asian nations. Singapore comes to mind. Middle Eastern nations as well, Saudi Arabia. We had some students that were here from India, and these guys were going to go through flight training, and then they were going to go back and fly MiG-29s for the Indian Air Force. I always told those guys, hey, I'll go back and take your seat if you guys don't make it through this program. So I was kind of envious that they would get to go back and fly such an iconic aircraft, the MiG-29, back in their home,
of course,
back in India. But yeah, we had a number of nations: Jordan, Singapore, Saudi Arabia. Even had an Aussie come through, a Spaniard come through. So from all over the world, our allies send their people here to train.
That's really incredible. So obviously that kind of bookends the Navy career, 27 years of total military service, and then you retired as a lieutenant commander, correct?
That's correct. Retired in 2015.
Very cool. Okay, so the reason I'm not trying to end that, if there's other stories, obviously, stop me. Let's make sure we talk about them. But since then, you have, what is it, over 4,000 hours total flight time. Not all of that is military. A lot of that is civilian, to include in the B-25, to include in both of your airplanes, to include in a whole other world. So I want to try to talk through a little bit of that now, and I don't want to take away any of it. But what drove you? And I want to make sure I also tag into the right part of your military career. What drove you to find the Yak and to find the Stearman, the 2 airplanes that you currently fly today?
Okay, so I'm very fortunate that flying has been a long time, lifelong pastime and passion. Very fortunate that I was able to do it as my profession, professionally in the military. That was my dream, was to serve the nation and to fly while doing so. But I've always thought that I would have an aircraft someday, and just kind of a personal goal. I started buying my first plane, a Yak-52, back in 2000. I was actually still in Japan at the time, so I was stationed over there in Japan. And, you're going to sea all the time, getting paid all the big bucks as a young Lieutenant JG. I had paid off all my student loans, and then the thought hit me, hey, maybe I'll buy the plane now. I always thought that would be much farther down the road. So I started looking into it. My original goal was to buy a Stearman biplane. But I just happened to come through some online research, come upon the Yak-52s. Did some research, decided that that'd be more akin to my primary flight training experience in T-34s. Planes very similar in performance, albeit the Yak-52 has a radial engine instead of a turbine. And so the more research I did, the more it kind of pointed me in that direction. I guess, that's the way things turn out. But I took some leave when I was over in Japan. I came back to the United States. I saw a yak over in California. I flew to West Virginia, saw a yak over there, stopped by to see family in Kansas City, and I saw another yak there. Well, long story short, I ended up purchasing a yak from a company in California. Now, the interesting thing about this plane is when I said, hey, I'm going to buy a plane, this plane was still over in Russia. They basically gave me a list of aircraft, and not knowing any better, not having any information, I basically pointed to one and I say, I'll take this one. And so they acquired the aircraft, sent the aircraft to Lithuania, where it went through a full refurbishment. Engine was overhauled. All the airworthiness directives were complied with, resurfaced the flight controls, went through all the systems and the lines, new tires, and then they said, hey, how do you want this thing painted? So it was kind of interesting. I'm in Japan, they're in Lithuania, I'm dealing through the company in California. They send me 3 aircraft diagram, and they say, tell us how you want this plane painted. And that was a very hard decision to make, so I finally ended up coming up with a paint scheme. It was inspired by a P-51 Mustang in World War II. The aircraft name was Big Beautiful Doll. It was polished aluminum overall with black and white checkerboards on the nose and whatnot. So that's kind of what I went with. Instead of polished aluminum, though, I was concerned about corrosion, so I had the plane painted silver. Black and white checkerboards on the nose, on the horizontal stabilizers and wingtips. And then, of course, I had to leave those Russian stars on there. So I've got big red Russian stars on the fuselage, wings, and also the tail. But that was the first plane I bought, and its delivery coincided with me coming back here to flight instruct. And I like to say that I am the longest standing owner of that aircraft. More than the former Soviet Union or Russia. I have now owned that aircraft longer than they did.
That's awesome. Do you know its history as a flight trainer? Do you know where it was stationed? Was there any kind of paperwork that came with it after it was refurbished in Lithuania?
I don't know very much about its previous life over there in Russia. And that would be a research topic that I should probably look more into and try to ascertain. But I do know that these aircraft were designed in the mid-'70s, and they started producing them. Mine's a 1983 production. And, it's just been a great aircraft. They were used initially as a primary trainer in an organization called DOSAF, which was, for lack of a better term, a flying club. But it was a paramilitary organization that would be kind of the first step in training a Soviet pilot for the Air Force.
Okay, very cool. One of the things I've had the privilege is flying with you several times.
Yes.
Some foreign flights, some air-to-air flights. That back canopy opens up, and it's great for photography. One of the things I've noticed about it, there is for lack of better terms, an idiot panel on the back with different emergencies. And as I recall, and please correct me if I'm wrong, obviously the instructor's in the rear seat, so the person that can override is that rear seat station, which is dangerous if you have a untrained, person like me, or a passenger in the back seat. So there are certain, I don't know if modes is the right term, but certain things that I could theoretically do in that back seat. From a training perspective, you want to simulate an emergency, an alternator issue, or some other light. But the reality of it is, as a training airplane, you probably either have those disabled or make sure it's very clear in the brief. Don't come anywhere near touching those.
That's right.
Yeah.
The aircraft is very straightforward, very robust construction, and is just a great designed, well-flying aircraft. But yes, Antonio, you're absolutely right. In the back seat, there's a panel there with a bunch of switches that you can fail, and this is, again, to try to train the pilot to look for these failures and to address them during their training curriculum. I do have some of these that are safety wired in the off position so that someone doesn't help themselves to the switches, so to speak. But the one that always worries me the most is right on top of the rear stick is a brake fail button. And I'm always worried that someone might inadvertently push that, and then you'll have no brakes. And especially during run-up or warm-up or something along those lines, the aircraft starts to creep forward without any brakes on.
Of course. And speaking of brakes, it's all pneumatic, all air-powered.
That's right. So the aircraft is a very unique design and construction because of the harsh operating environment that it would have served under up in Siberia. This aircraft is designed to operate in colder climates. It has an air system, a pneumatic system that provides air under pressure for four main things. Number one is engine start. Number two is operation of the landing gear retraction and extension. Number three is the operation of the brakes. And number four is operation of the flaps. So it's a very ingenious system. It's kind of the Achilles heel of the aircraft, however, because you have to operate and maintain the system and keep it from leaking, which invariably happens.
Another thing, the gear is not protected. So on the ground with the engine running, if I move that handle up, the gear is going to retract.
That's right.
Which is a terrifying prospect.
Well, American aircraft are typically well thought out, well designed, and they've tried to idiot-proof these aircraft, if you will. So in the T-34C, for example, it had what they call a squat switch, which would mean that when the gear are down and the aircraft is on the ground, you can't inadvertently raise the gear by activating the switch. The switch will disable the lever in the cockpit. Now, that's not the case in the case of the Yak-52. You move that lever, the gear's going to fold up right then and there.
Yeah. So I know you had, and I don't know if this is something you want to talk about, the Crestview Yak. I know you've had an interesting day or two in a Yak. This is something that I've had friends that have flown, obviously, fixed wing, rotary wing, high-performance jets in some cases. A lot of them will literally sit down in the airplane that day and say, today, I'm flying in a Mustang. And think through, this is where my hands go, this is where, because, for example, the reason I mentioned that Soviet mindset, the design versus maybe a more American design, be it in a Cessna or that T-34 you mentioned. Is that something you've ever experienced or felt, the difference in that initial, what you learned first is what you learn best, is that saying we often, make in naval aviation. Have you ever noticed that default setting might be to something maybe that you would have learned for a different aircraft, or is that something that's never really been a concern for you?
Well, it's always a concern. And one thing to keep in mind is that flying is a process, okay? You just don't jump in something and go. We're taught to fly, especially in my experience, you're taught to fly the Navy way, which is a very process-oriented type of flying. You always start with a brief. And then, of course, there are several things you check. For example, the weather, the NOTAMs, TFRs, etc. And then you go through and you check the aircraft and you sign for the aircraft, etc. So it's a procedure, process-orientated evolution to go flying. And I think luckily for me, I've always carried what I learned in the Navy with me when I fly general aviation aircraft, okay? So I always try to subscribe to that process. For example, when does a flight start? Hey, as soon as you're thinking about flying, you're thinking about what you need to do to accomplish that flight. So you start to prepare yourself personally. You start to mentally prepare yourself. Even though you may not have a crew, you might be flying solo, you still brief yourself. And of course, yes, every time you're getting ready to fly a different aircraft, you're always thinking, okay, today I'm flying a Yak. Vastly different than flying a Stearman. So I always try to think through the things I'm going to be doing, okay? Especially a different landing technique required for both of these aircraft. One is tricycle landing gear. The other is conventional or tailwheel landing gear. So thinking through how I'm going to perform the takeoff, thinking through how I'm going to perform the landing, thinking through how I'm going to operate in the pattern. The other thing is the Yakolev retractable landing gear. Stearman, landing gear are down and locked, non-retractable. So the last thing you want to do is not prepare yourself mentally, go fly one of these aircraft, and then try to use procedures for a different aircraft while you're flying something different.
Absolutely. Makes sense. So speaking of the Stearman, when did you acquire yours? Because as I recall, that was another West Coast purchase. That airplane flew all the way here from California, right? That's
right. So I've bought 2 aircraft in my life, and the ironic thing about them is they were both in California, and I bought them both here to Florida. The first one being the Yak. I started to acquire that in 2000, took delivery in December of 2001. The second being the Stearman. Again, that was the original dream, was to have a Stearman. I started purchasing the process when I was actually in Afghanistan. I was doing some shopping there in my free time on the internet. Came across this great plane. It was owned by the owner of Aircraft Spruce, Jim Irwin. And anyway, I'd been shopping for a Stearman for about 5 years. And when this one came up on the market, I did a lot of research on the aircraft. I reached out. He had a maintainer. I got a lot of information and logbook entries from him. So I told Jim, I said, hey, I'll buy this plane on 2 conditions. Number 1, you'll hold it for me, okay, until I get back. And number 2, the aircraft will go through a pre-buy inspection and its annual inspection, and it passes. So we made that kind of arrangement. I didn't even dicker on the price, and because I figured, hey, he's nice enough to hold the aircraft. Several months later, when I got home, then flew out to California and took delivery of the aircraft.
Gotcha. Pre-buy was good, obviously, so that's good.
Yeah, so the pre-buy ended up, the aircraft was deemed to be serviceable, and the annual inspection was, it passed its annual inspection. Now, I did learn some things about the Stearman, and one thing that was not detected, and this is kind of an interesting story, a little aside here, when the aircraft went through those inspection processes, one thing that they did not check is the quantity of fuel in the fuel tank. Now, the Stearman is supposed to hold 46 gallons. Back in the day, like when they were using these planes for crop dusting and whatnot, the crew members serving these planes, they'd jump up on the fuel tanks and they would sit on them and hold the fuel, because you're fueling the fuel tank, which is in the center section of the top wing. So it's one of the hardest things about flying the Stearman is refueling the aircraft. Well, anyway, back in the days of crop dusting and whatnot, they would jump up on top of the fuel tanks. They'd sit down next to the fuel filler port, and they would be fueling up the aircraft. So on my aircraft, the top of the fuel tank, unbeknownst to me, not visible from the exterior, had been concaved enough that I did not hold the full 46 gallons. So think about this. When I flew that plane back from California to Florida, I thought I had 46 gallons of fuel on board. In actuality, the maximum I would have ever had was 34.5 gallons on board. That is an appreciable difference. And when I've gone back through my logbook and I've looked at the flight times that I flew, I estimate that at times I was probably within 5 minutes or so of running out of gas. This is not standard. This is not procedure. This is not regulation. This was not my intention, but that's what happened.
Yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah. Glad I didn't run out of gas over the Great Divide or flying back across the desert.
Yeah. How long was that flight? I'm assuming that was not a couple-day adventure going from California to Pensacola.
Yeah, so when I got out there to California, the aircraft was still undergoing the inspection. So when I got out there, it was in pieces. And it took us a while to get everything back together. I burned up all my leave out there in California waiting for the plane to come back together. But when we actually got on the road to fly the plane back, it was 6 days of hard flying. So we did get a weather delay for a little bit of time and a little bit of maintenance delay. But overall, able to make it back in 6 days.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it was great.
Is that the longest flight you've done? Because I know you fly the airplane extensively and you've flown long distances. But is that probably the longest flight you've flown?
I would say yes, the longest continuous kind of straight line.
Okay.
But I have taken the aircraft up to Galesburg for the Stearman fly-in a couple times, and I've done quite a bit of cross-country work in the bird, taking it over to Texas a number of times as well.
How is it as a cross-country machine? Is it kind of
slow?
And it's an open cockpit airplane. So.
Yeah. But I'll tell you, it's the best cross-country aircraft in that regards. It's open cockpit. It's the greatest way to see America, up close and personal, right there from a classic biplane. Nothing gets better.
Yeah. The analogy almost maybe like a motorcycle, I'm guessing.
Yeah. You can consider that like an airborne Harley Davidson. You've got that big radial engine up there. I've got the 220 horsepower Continental. That's the W670 Alpha engine on that aircraft. So it's quite a roar and a very unique radial engine sound. But yeah, it's open cockpit all the way, so it's like being in a convertible.
I know you fly the airplane in formation a lot. How is it compared to the Yak as a form platform? Is it pretty stable?
Well, it's a great formation aircraft, but a couple things that make it unique is, number one, you've got that top wing up there. So you really need to be cognizant of that when you're flying in close formation with another aircraft. Maneuvers such as a cross-under or those type of things, you can lose sight of your lead aircraft if you're not careful. So we have specialized procedures for flying that aircraft in formation. I think it's a great aircraft for flying formation. The other thing that makes it unique is that it's a big aircraft with a lot of drag and, relatively speaking, low horsepower. So you got a lot of aircraft powered by 220 horsepower in the original configuration, like mine is. So you don't have a lot of what we'd call smash, a lot of power excess to catch up to a lead aircraft. So it really makes it a challenge to keep up with lead, and a good lead pilot will always take that into consideration. For example, when they roll into a turn, they might tweak off a little bit of power. That way, if you're on the outside of the turn, you can add a little power to stay up with lead. But other than that, it's a great formation aircraft. It's a great flying aircraft all the way around, and it's just an iconic biplane. It's an honor to own one.
Absolutely. Not many people have a 1942 model airplane in their hangar.
Right.
We talked about the legacy of the Yak. Maybe a little bit of question exactly what it did in the war, or in the 80s, I should say.
Yeah.
Not so with the Stearman. You know exactly where it was and what it did. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's right. So I know quite a bit about the history of this particular Stearman. During the war, they built just over 10,000 of these aircraft to support the wartime effort. All of the services were operating the Stearman, so that's the Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard. They all trained together, and they used them. They called them the N2S series biplane as a primary trainer. The Army Air Corps, which then became the Army Air Force, which then became the U.S. Air Force, used them as a primary trainer as well. So over 10,000 aircraft produced to support all the armed services in the United States. Of that production run, there were a special production run of 300 aircraft that were produced to be given to the Canadians under the terms of Lend-Lease, the Lend-Lease agreement. So my plane was built in June of 1942. As soon as it was produced, it was sent right up to Canada. So they flew that aircraft right up to Canada. And I've got some of the information at home, but I believe it served in Alberta with one of the training squadrons for instructors. Now, the problem is it's an open cockpit aircraft, open fabric construction covering over the wings and fuselage. By December of 42, winter up there in Canada, it had gotten too cold to operate these aircraft, and they were basically all sent home. So my aircraft was sent home, spent a little bit of time in Jackson, Tennessee, and then it wound up in Terrell, Texas, which is just 30 miles to the east of Dallas. It went to the #1 British Flying Training School, and that's where it served the bulk of its wartime training. From early 43 to mid 44, it was right there in Terrell, Texas.
Okay, very cool. So the British students that were flying your airplane, what did they do when they went back home? Is there any way to know? I know you're obviously very much into history.
Yes.
What did this airplane step them up into next?
Right.
So the interesting thing about World War II, it was a global conflict. And we were supporting our allies. One of our strongest allies was Great Britain. As everyone knows, Nazi Germany was able to invade and occupy the greater part of Europe. Flight training in Great Britain at the time was a very dangerous prospect. Not only the weather was an impediment to training, but also, too, marauding German fighters. You could be up on a training mission and all of a sudden get jumped by a Messerschmitt 109 and get shot down. So it wasn't the ideal training climate or environment for training over there. The Brits sent a lot of their young flight students over here to America, which is kind of an unknown facet of the wartime history. But a number of their flight students, cadets, came over here. We trained them, sent them back, and from there they would have gone right into defending their nation. So a lot of those guys went into fighters to fly fighters to defend England. Some of them became reconnaissance pilots, and then some of them became bomber pilots as well.
That's awesome. That's really cool. So one of the really cool things that you have kept in touch with the folks in Texas, and there is a museum there, a wonderful museum dedicated to. Yep.
So when I got the aircraft, I didn't know the history, and I started doing some research, and that's when I found out about this interesting facet of the aircraft's history. And again, very fascinating, and trying to unravel the history of the aircraft. Oh, I wish that plane could talk to me and tell me who had flown that plane and all of its experiences. But all you have really is a little bit of records here and there that you kind of piece together and you figure out what the plane did during the war. There is a museum in Terrell, Texas that commemorates the #1 British Flying Training School. As soon as I had learned this, this was 2013, so the year after I acquired the aircraft, I reached out to them. They had a website, Facebook page, and I sent them an email. I said, hey, I've got this aircraft you guys might be interested in. You'll probably want to know more about it. And they came right back to me and they responded. And so we started the relationship and correspondence and talking to those folks. They ultimately sent over a couple of their people to come see the plane and talk to me. And I'm a historian. I love history, and I feel compelled to honor history and try to participate in history. So I started thinking, hey, what's my end goal here? Now, in the Stearman community, we often say you don't own a Stearman, you're just holding it for the next generation, which is kind of true. It's an honor to own these planes and to operate them. So I start thinking about my personal situation. I'm like, hey, if I have this plane for 10 years, that'll be enough, and I can pass this along to the next generation. So we made this agreement in 2015 with the museum that we would kind of share the aircraft for now. So 2015 to 2025, at that period, we're going to go ahead and give that aircraft, donate that plane to the museum. And it will move to Texas, and it will be part of their permanent collection. In the meantime, the folks out there at the museum have just been really great. We have great relationship. They have a great museum. They're working hard to expand the museum. They have also provided some funding to help maintain and preserve the aircraft. So again, we're in a joint venture together, and I highly recommend it. If you're ever in the Dallas, Texas area, go see the museum and check it out. Again, not to advertise here,
no, please,
but
please.
I do feel compelled to put a plug in for them.
Of course.
But 2025, the aircraft will go over to the museum, and I'm happy to have had the plane and taken care of the plane for this period of time. But then that plane will be shared by all.
That's wonderful. Well, speaking of, perfect transitions here. speaking of sharing by all, one of the coolest things truly that I think you do with that airplane is the Veterans Flight Program.
Yes.
And I know you'll talk about that here in a second, but one thing I really want to mention that I think is really incredible, I would have never thought this in a million years, I'm going to use the wrong term here, hubcap.
Oh, yes.
Is hubcap the right word?
We call it a hubcap.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
The hubcaps on the Stearman come off. And one of the things, all the wonderful people that you've taken flying, a lot of them who have obviously served in World War II, served in Korea, served in many other conflicts, you've had them sign them. And so that's a really, I would have never in a million years, my RV6, we don't have hubcaps, but
Right.
all that to say, that piece of that history continues flying with you by their signature. And I know you've flown a lot of really special folks. I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about that and some of the veterans you've taken flying in your airplane.
So one of the great things about the Stearman, during the war, its wartime mission was training young pilots. Because of that, it has 2 cockpits, their tandem seating arrangement. In the war, the instructor pilot would have sat in the front cockpit. The student pilot, under training, would have sat in the rear cockpit. In the modern era, we've had to add electrical systems and radios, transponders, now ADS-B to the aircraft. So typically, a lot of these modern instruments and switches, etc., have been added to the rear cockpit. So you fly the aircraft primarily from the rear cockpit now. But having that other cockpit has allowed me and every other Stearman owner to share the experience with a lot of people. For the museum, I think I've flown well over 100 rides. Just myself as a personal owner, I've probably flown several hundred rides in my Stearman. Flying with another great organization, the Commemorative Air Force, I've flown close to 200 rides with them. But one of the great things about the Stearman is the ability to share that aviation experience. One of the great initiatives that I've become involved with here in Pensacola is called Veterans Flights. It's now a nonprofit 501c3 educational organization. And the whole mission is to honor our veterans, those that served in World War II. We've been doing this. Myself, I've been involved in this since late 2013, 2014 timeframe. And I've been able to be involved every single year since. But the mission of Veterans Flight is, again, to honor our veterans. Every year during the Blue Angels Beach Air Show in July, we fly World War II veterans. And these veterans are incredible. They did so much. They sacrificed so much. And the ones that survived the war, most fortunate, it's our way of honoring them and their service and their sacrifice, just to give them a little bit of taste of aviation and thanking them for their service.
Absolutely.
One of my traditions is, as Antonio mentioned, I take those hubcaps off the plane, and when I have a veteran fly, I like to have them sign it so they can continue to fly with me.
What are some of the signatures you have on there? I can't even begin to remember. I saw you do it this last year. I know you've been doing it for several years.
Yeah, so many signatures. One of my favorites is one of the first veterans I flew, Colonel John Beard. I flew him, I want to say, back in 2014, 2015. And when we went flying, it's kind of funny because these veterans, you'll see them, they'll have their walkers or their canes, and they're walking out towards the aircraft. And as soon as they see those planes, you see their eyes light up. They drop the cane, they drop the walker, they stand straight up. They march over to the aircraft. You know, they want to put their hands on the wings and touch the fabric. And anyway, so Colonel Beard hadn't flown since 1966. He was a great passenger, just really enjoyed the flight. In fact, we're taxiing in, and he starts to unstrap his shoulder harness, and I see one strap come back and the other strap come back. I'm like, hey, Colonel, hold on a second. Let us get up to the line before we jump out of this thing, because he had really had such, well, I hope he wasn't trying to get out of my aircraft, but I think he had had such great experience during our ride. Anyways, more about Colonel Beard's experience. You know, he embodies the typical American service member. The war had started. He wanted to serve the nation. He went right down to sign up. He wanted to join the Army Air Corps. He wanted to fly. And one of the requirements back then was you had to have a high school diploma education. He didn't have that. He had grown up in kind of tough situation. In fact, I think he had been orphaned, lost his parents at a young age, had been orphaned, didn't have a full education. And so when he went to sign up, the recruiter said, "You got to have a high school education. You have your high school diploma, don't you?" And his response, knowing full well he didn't have one, was, "Hey, everybody's got a high school education, high school diploma." And so the recruiter obviously took that as yes, he had one when he didn't. But anyway, he was able to get into the Army Air Corps. He went over and served in North Africa, flying the B-25 Mitchell. Then from there, he actually served an extra combat tour because, again, he had no family to go back to. So when he had completed his number of missions and it was time to rotate back, he said, "Hey, I'll stick around. I'll serve again. I'll fly another tour." Flew another tour there, then went over to the CBI theater, which is China, Burma, India, and he flew supplies over the hump to support the Chinese who were fighting the Japanese. So all in all, he ended up flying 105 combat missions during the war. Pretty incredible story. Had become an aircraft commander in the B-25, and then had stayed in the Air Force after the war, and hadn't flown and stayed in until 1966, but he hadn't flown since 1966.
That's really incredible.
Yeah, just a great American.
Absolutely.
And he's one of the signatures on my hubcaps, so very proud of that one.
Well, I think a big a paradigm shift that a lot of folks don't realize. This is something I didn't realize until reading it recently. When folks signed up for World War II, they signed up for the duration. They were there in the military for the duration of the war.
That's right.
And that is very different than a mindset that I think, we have, 4 or 5 year enlistment, wings +8 for us naval aviators right now. They were in it to win it, literally.
That's it.
A very, just a different perspective on sacrifice.
And keep in mind, we have the hindsight of, from our vantage point, looking back on the history. In 1942, 1943, they did not know that the war would end in 45. So it could have been 1955 for all they knew. And looking at the odds stacked up against them, it's quite amazing the accomplishment of being able to end that war in such a short period of time. But it took the entire efforts of not only this nation, but all the allied nations to do so. Keep in mind the home front and American citizens working around the clock to produce the weapons of war, to arm the young service members over there overseas doing the fighting.
Absolutely. Well, you talk about sharing these airplanes. Another way you've done that, you already alluded to it, is the Commemorative Air Force. I think you're the head of the, I want to make sure I say it right, the Floribama.
That's right. So the Commemorative Air Force is a great organization. Again, it's a museum. Mm-hmm. And what makes them so unique is it's a flying museum. So all of the aircraft that they own operate. They fly. They started in the 1950s, late 50s, a group of crop dusters down in South Texas. They thought, hey, it'd be really cool. Let's go out and buy a Mustang. This was a war surplus aircraft. So they went out and bought a P-51 Mustang. And they would share this plane. Guys would go out and fly it. And they were like, hey, let's get another aircraft, and then we can dogfight them. So they went out and got another aircraft. I want to say a P-40 Warhawk. Anyway, long story short, they ended up adding to the collection. Well, as they acquired several aircraft, they started to notice a very distressing trend, and that was all of these planes were being scrapped. They were being smelted down, destroyed. We were losing our aviation heritage. So they made it their mission to go out and to acquire at least one type of all of these aircraft. Well, I guess the rest is history, so to speak. Today, we have a fleet of over 175 aircraft of 60 different types of American aircraft that served in World War II. The mission of the CAF, Commemorative Air Force, is to honor our veterans, inspire future generations, and educate the general public. It's a great mission, and they do so by using these aircraft to teach about our history. I am a longtime member of the CAF, and I'm the wing leader of our small unit here, the Floribama Wing, stationed right here in Pensacola, Florida area.
Absolutely. I know about the L5, which is here.
Oh, yeah. So we're a relatively new unit of the Commemorative Air Force. Keep in mind, we have these in every state of the Union. And we also have several organizations outside the United States. But we were able to acquire our first aircraft, back in 2019, so 3 years coming up. And it's the mighty L5 Sentinel. It's a small reconnaissance aircraft. But, the great thing about this aircraft is Dwight D. Eisenhower said two of the most powerful aircraft during the war, the mighty B-29 Super Fortress, okay, that's laying down the big iron. It was a bomber. And then the L5, which could direct the fighting from the air. So it played a great role during the war.
And what a wonderful airplane for all the members here to get to enjoy. And I'm sure there's probably hopefully other airplanes on the horizon, maybe in the future.
That's right.
We'll see.
So this is a great aircraft. We use it for a number of missions. Like I said, we do a lot of static displays at air shows to try to teach the general public about our aviation heritage and our history. We've also used it for a number of air shows and fly-ins, and also for historical reenactments. For example, they did a 75th anniversary of the Battle of Peleliu. That's where the Marines came ashore and invaded a small island that we needed as a base during the island hopping campaign of World War II. They did a reenactment here locally on the coast, and we were able to participate in that. I was actually very fortunate at the time to get to fly that mission, and it dawned on me as I'm flying this reenactment, hey, I am doing the same exact thing as they did in World War II. So it was kind of one of those eureka moments. It was a great experience to be able to participate in that fashion, and to also for myself to learn kind of the history and how this aircraft was used in the war. But we just did another reenactment this past weekend, and that was with the USS Alabama. They have a living history unit there. They do reenactments aboard the ship. Again, the whole idea is to teach people our history. And so we do several things during this event. We have a great team of announcers that announce the aircraft that fly. The battleship Alabama reenactors, they get out there, they sound general quarters, they man the guns. They have their corpsmen that come out and help the wounded, so to speak, simulated, of course. And we use some of our local aircraft, actually our Yaks, to simulate the Japanese aircraft in World War II. And so we do a little simulated attack profile where they dive down like they're going to dive bomb, and then they do some torpedo attacks. And we always finish up with some flybys to some of the local aircraft. This last weekend we did a flyby with the L5, and then we've got some other light reconnaissance aircraft. Typically we'll end up with missing man formation. So a great way to honor our veterans and to play the national anthem.
Absolutely.
And to honor those that did not return.
Absolutely. I think museums are obviously very important places. We are a couple miles away from, I think, one of the greatest museums in this part of the world, the National Museum of Naval Aviation. And it's really wonderful to preserve those aircraft. And obviously some cannot fly again. You're not going to see a Curtis Jenny. They're out there. They exist. And as I was even trying to rack my brain, I think I can think of a flying Curtis Jenny out there. But some of those wonderful airplanes that are in the museum will never take to the skies again. But I think it is so important that there's organizations like the CAF that not only keep those airplanes flying, but let people fly in them. And frankly, those that have the desire, you can learn to fly them. And that's something I know you just got back from Texas, going through the ground school. And that was for the B-25 and some of the other aircraft, correct?
Yeah, so again, the thing that makes the Commemorative Air Force unique is the fact that we operate our aircraft not to detract from other museums.
Absolutely.
Here we are a couple miles from the Naval Aviation Museum. It is by far one of the greatest aviation museums in the world, bar none. But those aircraft don't operate. So you get to see them. They're in a static condition. But let me tell you, once you take one of these aircraft and you start it up, and you can see, and you can hear, and you can smell, and then you see the plane take off, and you see it fly by. It just adds a whole dimension to our understanding of these aircraft, the history, and those who served in them in World War II. So a longtime member of the Commemorative Air Force, just returned from ground school. Great group of aviation professionals that operate these aircraft. And every year we do what we call the Air Power History Tour. We travel around the country, taking the museum to the people so that people can appreciate these aircraft at their local airfields. Keep in mind, not everybody gets the opportunity to travel to Dallas-Fort Worth area. Hey, these aircraft will come into Huntsville, Alabama, Columbus, Georgia, Daytona Beach, Reading, Pennsylvania, you name it. That's one of the great things about the Commemorative Air Force.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. You get to keep sharing that passion that you have and letting folks, like you said, see that history in front of them. I know that's a lot of the thing that the Blues always talk about. There's not a lot of beachfront property in Iowa or other, maybe parts of the country. And so bringing that to people is really powerful and getting them to share it.
That's right.
Cool. Okay, Phil. Well, I think let's see. I'll look at the backup tape recorder here. We'll see. 3.5 hours. That's a new record for me. Bit of a longer form conversation. But as we kind of wrap up, I'm really curious. Number one, what didn't I ask you about? What should I have asked you about from some of your aviation history and some of your great stories of flying?
Well, very thorough interview here, Antonio. So thank you for this opportunity. It's been a real honor to serve the nation, both in the military, but it's also been a great pastime, a great passion of mine, aviation and getting the opportunity to fly. So I'm very fortunate that I got the opportunity. And, I represent all of the people in my life that helped me along in my aspirations and career. So parents, family, friends, and very fortunate there. But, aviation is a hazardous occupation. And when I think back to my military times, I've lost some good friends. And, I think for them, it's important for us to keep all this going. So I would like to honor, as a way of saying thanks, I would like to honor a couple of my friends that I've lost. Captain Barry Fleming, I mentioned his experience earlier. Another good friend, Captain Matt Thomas, he was lost in CH-53 off of Okinawa back in '99. Lost one of my best friends flying Valentine's Day of 2012, right before I shoved off for Afghanistan. And then recently I lost another good friend, Andy Travanchek, lost in August of last year in a T6. So anyway, I like to think that, they still fly with me. And another good friend is John Blake, call sign Saber, one of my Yakolev buddies, was lost as well. So anyways, great Americans all, and they serve their nation. And anyway, thanks for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Aviation is a very, very, very small world. I don't know if it's a great metric to keep. The most folks that I've known in a year that I've lost is 3. And I'd like to think exactly what you said, that by continuing flying, continuing to honor their memory, I know, just for the record for myself, that's what I would want others to do. I wouldn't want anyone to change a thing about the way they live their lives, to continue to enjoy the wonderful freedoms we have in this great country, to continue to fly. We learn from others. That's the greatest thing that I've been able to learn from so many other people, and I hope one of the greatest privileges is being back here with the kiddos, and I say that somewhat sarcastically, somewhat realistically. They're starting their career in naval aviation to go out and be the world's greatest NFOs, both for our country and for other countries, and I hope they realize just how serious it is, just how important it is, just how much they matter, and hopefully some of my rantings here and there. They take those lessons. I've taken a lot of lessons from you, and I really appreciate all the wonderful flying we've been able to do together. So thank you again for coming to speak with me, and hopefully we can go fly again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks, Antonio, for this wonderful opportunity, and we'll see you in the local pattern.
Sounds good, Phil. Thanks so much.